Good afternoon. Welcome to a special meeting of the Glendale City Council being called to order on October 24th at 2:03 p.m. And may we have roll call, please?
Yes, council members Asadarian,
Here.
Divine,
Here.
Kasakian,
Here.
Najarian,
Here.
Mayor Brotman.
Here. And could we start with your report, please?
Yes, the agenda for the Tuesday, October 24, 2023 special public meeting of the City Council was posted on October 18th, 2023 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Okay, thank you. And would you please read the item into the
Mr. Mayor, before she does that, can we, Councilmember Devine is asking to participate remotely under the new sections of the Brown Act, allowing a remote participation in case of a temporary physical disability or contagious illness. She's still recovering from a previous accident and would like to participate remotely. So if I could get a motion to allow her to participate remotely.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, and let's have roll call on that, please.
Council members Asadarian,
Yes.
Divine, Kasakian,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Mayor Brotman.
Yes.
She can't vote on it.
I think she can.
So,
It's
We haven't allowed her to participate.
oh, that's
Yeah.
correct.
What do you mean?
yeah.
So we're voting to let her participate.
Yeah, yeah.
She can't vote on that until we allow her to participate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we'll say it's a
Anyway, 4-0.
4-0. Okay, for the
Okay.
record. Okay. The lawyer in you, making sure we're dotting all the Ts and, no.
Yeah,
We
dotting all
cross
the
Ts
i's.
and we dot Is, the other way around. Okay, so now would you kindly read the item into the record, please?
Yes. The only item is city attorney regarding study session regarding city council districts and alternative voting methods, including ranked choice voting, cumulative voting, and limited voting. A motion directing staff.
Okay, and Mr. City Attorney, would
Thank you,
kick it
Mr.
off?
Sure, absolutely. Let me introduce, I think Marguerite's going to speak first. But so on October 10th, the council authorized or held this fourth public hearing on the district transitioning process. At the conclusion of that hearing, the council directed the study session be held to receive information on the following: the comparative cost of putting districts before the voters in March 2024 in comparison to November 2024. Receiving additional information on alternative voting systems, including the items listed on the agenda, and conduct the council discretion that have been submitted or prepared by the city. With respect to the first item regarding the comparative election costs, since the March 2024 election is already our general municipal election, the marginal cost of adding ballot measures is estimated to range from $8,000 to $25,000, whereas the cost for the county to run an election in Glendale in November 2024 is estimated to be between $422,000 and $440,000. And again, that's the difference because our election in March is already occurring, so there's really just a marginal cost to look at. So with that, the city's outside legal counsel, Marguerite Leone, and consultant Doug Johnson of NDC will lead the rest of the discussion. Ms. Leone will discuss the California Supreme Court's decision in Pico Neighborhood Association versus the city of Santa Monica and the legal underpinnings of the alternative voting methods to be discussed here today. And then Dr. Johnson will discuss the mechanics of these alternative voting systems or methods and some of the procedural challenges with the implementation, and then provide an overview of the maps. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. Leone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Garcia. And I will be sharing a PowerPoint.
We can just put it up, and then we'll move it along at your direction.
Do you want to do that, or I've got it right here, Mike?
Well, actually, it's probably easier if we do it here from our end. Can you see it?
I will in just a moment. Mike, actually, I see myself.
Okay.
Okay, that's,
Can you see it now, Marguerite?
yes, I can see it. That's just fine. And we can go to the next slide. So the purpose of this meeting is to delve into the relevance of alternative electoral systems with regard to the California Voting Rights Act. What prompts this meeting are new developments in the law in the California Voting Rights Act, including the Supreme Court's decision in Pico Neighborhood Association versus the City of Santa Monica, which is the first California case that has ever discussed the relevance of, I'll call them alternative electoral systems to the analysis under the California Voting Rights Act. And those alternative systems were actually mentioned in the opinion. The ranked choice voting, cumulative voting, and limited voting. I am going to give you the legal overview that comes out of the Santa Monica decision, and then Dr. Johnson will follow me with details about the operations of these systems, experiences in other jurisdictions, and some level of discussion of pros and cons. Before we launch into this, I wanted to put up some data because it's going to be relevant to the discussion. So this is to remind everybody where we are in terms of the eligible voting strength of protected classes in Glendale. The LCVAP is obviously Latino citizens of voting age. That population is about 17% citywide. Our Asian Pacific Islander eligible voter group, about 15%. We have many draft plans that this council has considered over the last 4 to 5 public hearings. And what we have learned is that in all of the plans, the strongest Latino district we can create is in the range of 28% eligible voters who are Latino. Sometimes it's 27, we might have a shade above 28, sometimes it's 26, but that's about the range. Similarly, with our Asian and Pacific Islander population of eligible voters, the best district ranges from about 18% to about 20% in a single member district. I just want to have those numbers before us as we continue the conversation. Next slide. So what are the lessons from the Santa Monica case with regard to issues pertaining to alternative systems? Number one, the court confirmed that the plaintiffs actually have to prove racially polarized voting. And that's going to be significant with alternative systems. So that's set. Everybody has known that. It's expressed in the California Voting Rights Act. The issue before the court in Santa Monica was whether the plaintiffs were required also to prove vote dilution. And the court said, yeah, racially polarized voting just isn't enough. You must also show that as a result of the at-large system and of the racially polarized voting, there's also vote dilution. For example, there could be cases where racially polarized voting occurs, but there's no vote dilution because it doesn't undermine the ability of protected classes to elect. So the court said, certainly, you have to be able to prove vote dilution. But this is significant. The city of Santa Monica said the only way you can prove vote dilution is by proving that in a single member district, you could be the majority of the eligible voters. That majority, theoretically, if it is cohesive and votes cohesively, would have the power to elect chosen candidates. And the city argued that to prove dilution, protected class voters either had to be a majority in a single member district or a near majority. Now you remember, I put up some numbers a few slides back. And the best we can do in Glendale is about 28% for Latino eligibility, and in the same plan, about 20% for Asian Pacific Islander eligible voters in a single member district. The court said that you do not need to be a majority, and in the Santa Monica case, the plaintiffs were only able to prove that they were 30% of eligible voters in a single member district. So that's relatively close to the 28% that can be accomplished in the city of Glendale. So even with small numbers, a California Voting Rights Act lawsuit and victory are possible. Going to the next slide. So how do you prove vote dilution? So vote dilution is dilution of the ability to elect candidates of choice. And what the court said, look, in California nonpartisan elections, you don't need a majority to win. So something less than a majority must be enough. And the court said what you need to do is just prove that under some other lawful alternative system, the protected class would have the ability to elect. And how you decide that is identifying the alternative system and then looking at the totality of the circumstances. The totality could include the degree of racially polarized voting, the number of candidates that run, the amount of crossover voting, etc. So these are the rules that the court set. So going to the next slide, that raises the question, what are lawful alternative electoral systems? Glendale is a charter city, and it has constitutional authority to design an electoral system for the election of its own governing body, literally any way it chooses, so long as it meets constitutional challenges. So for Glendale, the alternatives include by-district elections, and we've been looking at those very closely. Cumulative voting, we haven't discussed that yet, but Dr. Johnson will discuss how that works, as well as its feasibility. Limited voting, which is not used in California, is available to Glendale. Dr. Johnson will be discussing its feasibility, what a limited voting scenario looks like, and ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is used with a growing number of jurisdictions, I think exclusively in Alameda County and San Francisco in Northern California. A CVRA case was recently settled with ranked choice voting in the city of Albany. Ranked choice voting is available as an electoral system for charter cities. All the cities in Northern California that are using ranked choice voting are in fact charter. And then another issue that has arisen in recent academic literature is a system of voting called approval voting. And Dr. Johnson will be looking at that too and discussing that. So moving on. So one of the alternatives is, of course, by district elections. And the Supreme Court said that even at 28%, let's use Glendale as the hypothetical, minority or protected class voters may be able to demonstrate that in that particular district, given the greater concentration of protected class voters, even with the same degree of racial polarization, within the confines of that district, that group would be able to elect. And that's what the city of Santa Monica demonstrated. At the trial court level, they demonstrated that at a 30% concentration in the Pico neighborhood, which could form a district, the outcome of elections would have been different in that minority preferred candidates would have been elected in that district. So note again, in Glendale, we have Latinos able to form approximately 28% of eligible voters in a single member district in a 6-district plan, and Asian Pacific Islanders come in at about 20% in a 6-district plan. Looking at all the facts and circumstances and the totality, plaintiffs may be able to show that in single member districts, the protected classes at these levels would be likely to elect. Next slide. But the court didn't stop with single member districts. It also said that the plaintiffs could attempt to prove dilution by referring to other electoral systems, not just the classic at-large or single-member districts. So the California Supreme Court expressly mentioned cumulative voting, limited voting, and ranked choice voting. And the court made the point that in some of these systems, at only 25% of the electorate, protected class voters may be able to elect chosen candidates if they meet what is called the threshold of exclusion. Dr. Johnson will be discussing that at length and how it would apply in the city of Glendale. So going to the next slide. So what is the threshold of exclusion? Dr. Johnson will be going over this in detail, but what it is simply is the percentage of vote that will guarantee a win under the most unfavorable circumstances. And there's a formula for it, and this formula wasn't made up by the Supreme Court. It is out there in the academic literature, and it's part of the expert reports in the Santa Monica case. And the formula is 1/1 plus the number of seats available. So in a vote for 3 election, the threshold of exclusion is 1/4, 1 plus 3, or 25%. If it's a vote for 5, now how do you get a vote for 5? That's if you don't have staggered elections. And there's no requirement that Glendale have staggered terms for its city council. But if you look applying the formula for 5 seats, the threshold drops to 16.7%. This is in the at-large system. Protected class voters would meet that threshold. And this is the example that the Supreme Court cited specifically in the Santa Monica case. In a vote for 7 election, then the threshold of exclusion drops to 12.5%. So in Glendale, there is a challenge in a vote for 3 election. Latinos constitute approximately 17% of eligible voters. That does not meet the threshold of exclusion. And Asian and Pacific Island voters, an even lower number at 15% of eligible voters. Dr. Johnson will be discussing this in far more detail. So moving on to the next slide. So comments on, quote, alternative electoral systems. First, except for the single member district alternative, all of them are at-large systems. crucially, the Supreme Court did not hold that one of those alternative systems protects from a CVR lawsuit. It said you can demonstrate the dilution argument using one of the alternatives. But if you use one of the alternatives and it still doesn't result in the election of protected class chosen candidates, the city is still exposed under the California Voting Rights Act.
Excuse me, Marguerite, can I ask a question at this point?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that. So if a city were to go to a, like, ranked choice or some other system, would it have to go through several election cycles before a plaintiff could make that argument that it's not resolving the dilution issue? Or how would that work?
Generally, that would be the argument, that you need to get the system, you would need to give the system time to work. And there is, in fact, federal case law that supports this. It may be several election systems, election cycles. As Dr. Johnson will discuss, there is a significant amount of voter education that goes into implementing one of these new styled systems in a charter city. And the first couple of times around, it could be a failure for any number of just technical reasons and voter education and voter understanding reasons, but eventually pick up to be effective in enabling protected class voters to elect candidates of choice. So yes, a new system would be protective in this sense. If the city were sued, one of the initial defenses is, look, we don't know whether this system works or not. It's only been used once. And what the United States Supreme Court has said, and also what the California Supreme Court said, is that it is performance over time that distinguishes losing a single election from a system that does not provide the ability for protected class voters to elect. So yes, it's not a defense from the lawsuit. It's a defense after the lawsuit is filed.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, next slide.
And if anybody else has questions, just jump in as we're going through.
Now, this is my last slide. I just wanted to outline the legal principles because Dr. Johnson is going to very deeply get into the nitty-gritty of all of this, including the voter education aspects and actually the initial risks to voters from these types of systems. I just want to make this point, final point, it's the adverse of what I just said. All of these are at-large systems, okay? The CVRA only applies to at-large systems. Once you have a properly and fairly drawn single-member district system, even if it does not result in the election of minority preferred candidates, it is not subject to the CVRA. So you have many, many maps out there based on community of interest. Your testimony, your process has been extensive. The maps are drawn consistent with the Federal Voting Rights Act, the Federal Constitution, and Fair Maps Act. If those maps, one of those maps is the choice of this council, and yet we don't have Latino or Asian and Pacific Islanders candidates elected in a district, the city cannot be sued under the California Voting Rights Act. Next slide. Here we are. Tried to keep it short. Happy to answer legal questions. If you would prefer to go to Dr. Johnson's presentation, I'm going to stick around and answer legal question at the end of the day.
Okay.
Your pleasure.
Questions, Councilmember Najarian?
Questions? Hi, Marguerite. This is Ara Najarian. Do we have any, we had some discussions in closed session. Is that waived at this point, or?
Councilman Najarian, I would advise not to waive the closed session, discussion. Obviously, it would require a majority vote of the council to waive or disclose anything that was discussed in closed session. But certainly, you can ask anything that's germane to her presentation, or
Okay.
I think she feels confident talking about Santa Monica generally.
Her presentation almost mirrored what we got in closed session.
And to the
there
extent that it's similar, there were some additional details, that was discussed in closed session that she did not cover here.
Okay, so, Marguerite, so is it true that plaintiffs in the Santa Monica case conceded that 25% or less of a population of LVAPs makes the issue moot? I'm talking about footnote 12 on page 28 of the Supreme Court decision.
I apologize for that.
Plaintiffs basically conceded.
Yeah, there was a proposal that 25% would be the floor.
Okay.
And the Supreme Court declined to adopt that as the floor beneath which no claim could be filed.
I think there was a floor that they discussed in other portions, but it was really the de minimis issue of, a
Right.
group of, I think they said 1.5% would be, we're wasting our time discussing this.
You're correct, Councilmember Najarian. You are truly correct. They said, there's no way that a group that increases their voting power from, for example, 1%, increases that 10 times to 10%, are ever going to be able to elect.
Right.
And
So,
if they can't be able to elect, they're not diluted.
so part of the decision here was, that number was something plaintiffs suggest it would be rare for a group constituting less than 25% of the voting population. Now, our number is, what is our number in Glendale?
28.
28. But the Supreme Court said, we're not going to make that rule. We're going to give that rule back to the Court of Appeals to come up with their standards. Isn't that what they said?
No, what the court said is the plaintiffs has suggested that, and there is federal case law that supports that suggestion. But what the court said is we're going to remand to the Court of Appeal to decide the dilution issue based on the standards we have just set up. And so it wasn't particular with regard to the 25%. It's the whole discussion. Can they prove dilution under using a cumulative voting standard? Can they prove dilution in the single member districts? Remember, they could form 30% of a district, and they actually put in evidence that they were able to elect. So yes, you are correct. It's back to the Court of Appeal to apply the law to the facts in the Santa Monica case. And we don't know when that's going to happen or the outcome of that application.
So procedurally, barring any settlement, if the Court of Appeal makes a ruling, that ruling itself could be appealed again, could it not, to the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it could be then sent back to the Court of Appeal with further direction. It seems a little ridiculous, but that's certainly a possibility.
It is among the possibilities, yes.
This is not one of the clearest opinions that I have read. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation and conjecture. One of those, which I'd like to make that I disagree with you on, is that an alternative voting system would have to guarantee a minority group to have an elected, to win an election. I argue, and there's language throughout, that that alternative voting system only has to give them a better chance at selecting a candidate than they do under the at-large system. And I'm referring to page 28 again of the opinion, where it says that the alternative method of election should improve the protected class's overall ability to elect its preferred candidates. So that's a big difference when we look at these different voting, and I haven't heard Mr. Johnson's presentation, but improving is a lot different than guaranteeing an election. So what, do you think there's ambiguity there? Am I reading this wrong? Am I skipping over? Because I'm pulling it directly from their opinion here.
This is what I believe the court was referring to there. But let me state at the outset that I agree with you. There are a lot of unanswered questions in the opinion, including what's the legal alternative? You know, I set forth for this study session's consideration a system where there are 7 members of the council without staggered terms. Now, that would technically be legal, but the governance challenges there would be significant. So what the court, number one, I agree that there are many unanswered questions there. What the court was referring to was evidence that was brought in by the city that there are currently sitting on the city council 3 candidates who are Latino and are arguably the chosen candidates of Latino council members. The formation of the Pico Neighborhood District would strengthen Latino ability to elect in that one district, but then limit it citywide. So as a result, over time, Latino representation in Santa Monica would become diminished rather than improved by the districting system. So how does one prove that? Once again, the totality of the circumstances. How many candidates run? How often does the Latino preferred candidate get elected? Does term limits figure into it? What is the strength of incumbency, et cetera? All of these things, bearing in mind that as long as the city maintains an at-large system, it's subject to challenge under the CVRA.
Oh, I'm not disputing that, except back to the that 25% issue. Let me ask you a question. I mean, we've heard about these horror stories of city of Santa Clarita and Palmdale, and poor Santa Monica is hit with this lawsuit, and they've spent tons and tons of attorney's fees, and they may have to pay the plaintiff's attorney's fees. What if we just went and filed a petition for declaratory relief to one of our local courts, which we're entitled to do, saying, we're in Glendale, we don't know what's going on, we're not sure, do we meet this threshold? Now, wouldn't that court say, we're not going to hear that case now, we're waiting for a decision from the Court of Appeal as to what standard to apply? Isn't that a very likely outcome? And we would have jumped the gun in bringing our own case before the courts rather than someone threatening us and dragging us to court, which might trigger the attorney's fees provisions.
Yeah, well, let me say there are some procedural challenges to the city suing itself for violation of the California Voting Rights Act. California courts are not in the business of issuing advisory opinions. I'm not quite sure who the city would sue, but I understand. This is the answer that I think would be likely. The Court of Appeal is really applying law to specific facts, and those are the facts in Santa Monica. In a case against the city of Glendale, the law would be the same because that law is set out in the Santa Monica case. But we would be applying it to facts in Glendale, which are different from the facts in Santa Monica. So whatever the Court of Appeal does in Santa Monica will be interesting and potentially relevant, but certainly not determinative.
Well, wait a minute. Didn't the Supreme Court say in its last line that, their last paragraph, to establish the correct legal standards? This case is only going to be specific to Santa Monica? Is that what you're saying? All these years of litigation, and the Supreme Court's going to let it sit as a one-off case with no precedent?
No, I'm certainly not saying that. The legal standards established by the California Supreme Court are applicable statewide. The application of those standards to the city of Santa Monica binds only the city of Santa Monica.
Well, it's an interesting discussion, and I'm not going to take any more of our afternoon time, but it's something that we'll continue with, I'm sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any other questions?
I asked all my questions during the briefing I had with them.
Okay. Councilmember Gasaki and
Not
Councilmember
not at
Devine?
this moment.
No? Okay. Then, thank you, Marguerite, and we will move on to Doug Johnson's presentation and learn more.
Good afternoon. I'll bring up the other PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of revisiting the draft maps and go through those, and then I'll get into the alternative voting systems. So we jump in. As Ms. Leone mentioned, we have a lot of draft maps out there. I'm not going to go through all of them. There are a variety of different options and approaches illustrated in these maps, ranging from all kinds of issues, such as how many districts south of the 134, is the Rancho in the west connected with the southwest part of the city? Where do the Chevy Chase and Glen Oaks Canyons go in the various maps? And jump on here. When we get into the numbers of them, and again, just as a quick reminder, race cannot be the predominant consideration. So this is one factor that can be considered, but you can't say, I'm going to take the map with the highest percentage, and what map is that, and pick that. It has to be in the context of looking at the whole map. But as you see, we have, in terms of Latino citizen voting age population, or CVAP, the highest district in a given map ranges from 18% in one map to 28% in another map. The higher numbers that you see, where you get up to 25 to 28, are generally where the Rancho area is connected with at least part of the Southwest, or in some of the maps, all the way down to the Tropico area. The 28% one, the way you get the highest is you connect the Rancho with Tropico and actually carve around Pelanconi. So you'll see in that map, it's a very narrow neck so that it doesn't include Pelanconi in that western district.
That gets us how much? I'm sorry.
That gets us to 28% of citizen voting age
The
population.
Pelanconi carve-out.
Yes. And curiously I can bring up any of these maps. That map actually picks up a part of Adams Hill in its process. So it's Rancho, a little piece of Pelanconi, but leaving out most of Pelanconi. Then it goes all the way down south and actually picks up a part of Adams Hill. So that's what gets you all the way to 28. But as you can see below that in the bullet, we have a handful of maps, about 7, that get you to 25 to 27%. And one thing that I want to make sure to emphasize is that the citizen voting age data and the renter data is based on a survey. The Census Bureau does a massive survey every year, and then they tally up 5 years worth of data. But it still has a margin of error. At the level of a district in Glendale, that margin of error is probably 3 or 4%. So while we may talk about 28 or 26 or 25, mathematically those are all the same because they're all within that margin of error.
So I think that's important when we were talking about that, in the decision, they mentioned, if I may, Mr. Mayor, the 25% number. The Supreme Court didn't rule on that, but that was pegged out there, pinned in the opinion. So that district that we're calling 28% could, on the low side, be a little less than 25%.
Yes.
Or it could be 30.
30, 31, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do we make sure? Is there any way to make sure of those numbers?
No. And a little background on this. This is a long give and take between the Census Bureau and the Department of Justice, where the Census Bureau always talks about, don't use the data at this level of geography, it's not valid. And the Department of Justice says, yes, you will, because it's the best available data. And yeah, in a battle between the Census Bureau and the Department of Justice wins. But the statisticians are saying this data is very vague, so don't worry about 26 versus 28. They're the same. 25 versus 28, maybe you're starting to get the edge of the margin of error, but yeah, choosing a map based on a 1% difference is a kind of a fool's errand.
Okay.
So taking the next step, so then, and the one map has 28, but then you see the 7 listed there, or 8 maps listed there that are 25 to 27%. And so what you get is, regardless of the exact number it's generating, if you're keeping that Rancho down to at least the middle of the south, the southwestern side of the city together, then you're going to get 25 to 27. The other maps generally get about 21% if you separate really at the freeway. And keep in mind we have this trade-off, right, in the different choices. So you get the highest Latino percentages if you bring a seat from the Rancho down to the southwest. But then we also have a number of residents saying, don't be blending the south with areas north of there. So it is there's no computer we can stick these different preferences into and get the best map, essentially. These are all trade-offs between different preferences. Similarly on Asian Americans, that we get a much smaller range. The lowest of the highest Asian percentages in any of the maps is 17%. The highest is 20%. Really, really close numbers. Really, what it really boils down to is we've got the largely Korean American concentration in La Crescenta, and then we have a pocket, you've seen the maps from earlier presentations, in Rancho San Rafael of heavily Asian American. If those two pockets are in the same district, you get 20%. If they're in different districts, you get 17 or 18. So that's what drives that trade-off between the different maps. And you can see the 3 maps there that link the Crescenta Highlands with Rancho San Rafael, and that gets you the 20% number.
So, Mr. Mayor, and Marguerite, is that a demographic we have to worry about in crafting maps? Obviously, the Latino is at that threshold.
I think,
is that something we need to worry about?
well, in terms of the Voting Rights Act, you can get in trouble both for not drawing a majority seat, which we're nowhere near in any of these maps, and you can also get in trouble for intentionally diluting them. So if a map were to split Rancho San Rafael between 2 seats, then you'd get in trouble. Or if there was a map that would split the Crescenta Highlands between 2 seats, then you'd get in trouble. But no, you're not going to run into legal liability.
We don't have to connect them
You don't have to.
to,
Right.
to do that.
Right. And in part because it's nowhere near a majority seat. If it was If connecting them got you into a 51% seat, then you get into a much more complicated legal analysis, but we're nowhere near that. And then the other demographic group or ethnic or racial group that comes up a lot is obviously Armenian Americans. And the most Armenian district in any of these maps varies from 36 to 45%. One change, the Armenian data you may remember we have is the counts of voters identified by PDI. So it's not citizen voting age population data, it's percentage of the voters as counted by PDI. And generally you get up to 45% if you keep essentially Northwest together, the whole Northwest Glendale neighborhood area. Keeping that together gets the highest percentage in a single district. And obviously we have lots of districts that are in the 30s and 40s in most of these maps. And then of course you've seen the demographic spreadsheets that have the data for all the other socioeconomic data that's available. In order to kind of focus the discussion on the maps, I picked these 5 out largely for 2 reasons. One, they kind of represent the most refined versions of different views of the maps. Yeah.
Mayor, before we go into the maps, I have some questions. Could I ask those now? Okay. So the reason I want to bring this up before we go through the maps, I had asked staff to provide a list of community organizations and groups for outreach to come up with these maps. I'm looking at the list now. When we started this process, we talked about the fact that the Latino community needs a voice, the API community needs a voice. I have no idea what the rhyme or reason was for this list. The Glendale Latino Association's not listed on here. None of our API organizations are listed on here. You have the YMCA, but you don't have the YWCA. I don't know why the Los Angeles Dignity Lions Club and Dynamic Clubs, they're 2 separate clubs, are included on here. But, you know, the whole point of this exercise was to make sure that our diverse communities had a voice in this process. And I don't know what this is. And if this was the only outreach, if someone can give me an answer, like, hey, beyond this list that we have, that you provided, what other outreach was done to our community organizations that represent these diverse communities? Because I have an issue with just looking at 18 maps, knowing that we haven't done this kind of outreach to them. So can someone answer my question before we move into the maps?
Yes, Councilmember Sarkian. Stephanie McLean will respond to your question.
Good afternoon, Council. To answer your question, Councilmember Sachin, that list that was provided to you, those were the direct follow-up conversations. That list is not the entirety of the outreach conducted in the organizations that we've done outreach. That was the list that we had on file, that we had done follow-ups, emails, and numerous levels of outreach. But there's more organizations than what you have.
Okay, I had specifically asked time and again, what are the organizations, all of the organizations that we reached out to? I got one list initially that had no contact information on there. And then I asked for I said, I want to see the contact information, because I remember from my time at the Parks and Rec Commission, one of my first meetings, I requested to see the list. I had not been the executive director for the ANC in like 8 years, and I was still listed as the contact. And so given that experience, this is the only list that was provided to me. And so my questions here today are based off of this, and this is all I have in front of me. And so if there is a larger list and I'm misspeaking based off of what's in front of me, then I would really like to see this. And I would really like to know, I would really like a thorough explanation of exactly which community organizations we reached out to, because this list to me is not unacceptable. I don't know who came up with it. But again, the Armenian National Committee is listed on it. It's the only ethnic one that's listed. There's probably 20 other Armenian organizations that should have been included on this list, but the Filipino community is not listed on here. This Latino, I needed to point that out before we went into the maps because I have no words on what I just said. So if there is a larger list, I'd like to see it.
We will get you a full outreach report. On that note, again, that list that you have is the phone call outreach and email outreach that was conducted by our outreach team. That does not include press releases, city connection that goes out to over 31,000 subscribers. So, and that's 31,000 subscribers, and we can try to get you that list as well.
So I recognize that, but everybody at the city hall, for example, knows that the Glendale Latino Association exists, that FABAC exists. So why are they not on this list? Or are they on another list, but
We will
we're
review
keeping
and get
track?
back. We will review and get back.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So jump into the maps, and again, we have a lot of maps. These are ones I chose just because they're kind of representative examples of the different schools of thought. You can see 106B on the left has 2 seats, the yellow and the purple, that are completely south of the freeway, and then a 3rd seat that goes from south of the freeway up to the Rancho, and then you've got a north canyons into Ross Moines, and then northwest seats. I picked some summary numbers from the demographic sheets that are next to them. So you can see in terms of how many districts have 75% of the residents are renters or more than 75. So in map 106B, there's 3 districts, the 4, 5, and 6, the orange, yellow, and red. I'm sorry, orange, yellow, and purple seats. Looking at income levels, how many of them have household income of 75,000 or more per year? In that case, it's 3. Latino citizen voting age population, you can see 26%. That's going to be in one. That's the highest in one district. And then Asian citizen voting age population, 18%. Because you can see in this map, Crescenta Highlands is in 2, and the Rancho San Rafael area is in 3, in the green seat. And then in this map, the highest percentage Armenian among the voters is 42%. Going to the right of that, in map 120B, this is a different approach where you get Rancho taking that whole southwestern portion in the green seat. Then you get Adams Hill, and one of the issues of Adams Hill is, does it stay with the south, or if it's in a southern seat, do the more homeowner or wealthier off residents of the Adams Hill neighborhood kind of dominate that seat? So in this case, it's got Adams Hill coming out and going with Glen Oaks Canyon in 2. Then you've got the orange District 5. It's essentially entirely southern. It comes up to Glen Oaks a little bit. And then you've got Crescenta Islands with Rancho San Rafael, northwest in District 4, and then Verdugo Woodlands and Ross Moines area in the yellow seat. And the numbers for this one are below it. So again, it's got 3 seats where renters are 75% or more, 3 seats where the average household income is 75,000 or more. The highest Latino percentage in this map is 25. The highest Asian, this is one of the configurations that gets you that 20% number. And again, the Armenian numbers are 42%. One of the things you're seeing is fairly radically different maps between 106B and 120B, but not much in terms of demographic differences. The numbers are not that different when we go from map to map. 122 to the right of it, this is, again, has 2 southern seats. They're numbered differently, but the 2 southern seats and then the Rancho to the south seat is very similar. It's actually very similar to 106B, except in some of the little details of where 4 and 5 come together. And the numbers work out to be very similar. You get slightly lower Latino citizen voting age number at 25 versus 26, but again, a 1% difference is a rounding error, essentially. 18% and a 43% Armenian voter in the highest Armenian district there. 124, I do want to note, if you've gone through all the emails, we got a number of emails about 114 of people who liked map 114. 124 is very, very similar to 114. It's just a little bit more fine-tuned. Essentially, this came in later, and I think they just kind of cleaned up the edges of 114. And in this case, you can see a very different configuration. You've got really 4 renter-dominated seats. So you've got the Rancho seat stays entirely north of the freeway, but it's in that Glen Oaks corridor, so it's 75% renters. Then you've got the 2 southern seats, 5 and 6, the orange and yellow. And then District 4 gets kind of the downtown and goes along the freeway there, picking up largely renter areas as well. So in this case, this is the one that shows significant demographic difference in that you have 4 districts that are a supermajority of renters. You also end up with just 2 seats where the average household income is $75,000 or more. Obviously, it's 1 and 2 in the north and northwest. And you get a very different impact. Essentially, in the northwest, the boundary between 2 and 3 is Kenneth at first, and then it steps down a little bit and becomes Glenwood. So you've got north of Glenwood and north of a little bit of Kenneth over in the Burbank area. And then it comes across and gets Verdugo Woodlands and Ross Moyne all into District 2. And then, as I mentioned, that you've got 2.5 south of the freeway there. And then the last kind of school of thought, this one, the big difference that 125 shows came up in a handful of maps, and it creates kind of a central district. You can see that green District 3 that's both north and south of the freeway. So in this case, that central district is drawn with a seat that goes Rancho to the southwest. Then you've got Adams Hill in the one entirely southern seat. And then the canyons and going a bit into Ross Moyne and a little bit south of the freeway in 2, and northwest in 4, and Crescent Highlands down to Verdugo Woodlands in 1. And that one, again, gets 3 districts that are where renters are a supermajority, 3 districts where the majority income is $75,000 or more, a 25% Latino seat, a 19% Asian seat, and 43% Armenian seat. So in terms of socioeconomic demographics that we get in the various maps, you get a little bit of difference between 18 to 21 at one end to 25 to 28% Latino seat. And then the real difference among the maps is 3 supermajority renter districts versus 4 supermajority renter districts. So the other piece of districts, and this we really don't have to discuss in detail or come back to until you have it narrowed down to a couple of maps, but is the election sequencing. When we're going, if we are going to go to 6 districts with a citywide elected mayor, you'd have the 3 districts that are normally, the 3 seats that currently are up in 2026 would be 3 districts that would be up in 2026. We'd add to that the mayor, and then in order to immediately get to 7, because you don't want to have an even number of members of the council for 2 years, you then have a 4th district that would hold a 2-year election. So one of the districts would be chosen that would hold an election in 2026, and then it would then hold an election in 2028 that would start its 4-year cycle. So this is just how you get, when you change the size of the council, you end up generally needing to do one of these 2-year seats in order to get the council size up and then get you back onto an evenly balanced election sequence after that. And then, so starting in 2028, you have the 3 districts up. The 2 that will be up in 2024. The 2-year seat would then have its first full term election in 2028, and then you'd have 3 seats up every 2 years going forward after that. There is an impact on the current council members of how the election sequence works out. If a council member elected in 2024 ends up in a 2026 seat, then they can either just serve that term and leave the council in 2028, or they can actually run midterm. If they're in a 2026 seat, they could run in 2026 for that seat. A 2026 council member who ends up in a 2028 seat would just leave the council in 2026 because the seat they live in would not be up for election. They could then run in 2028, but not as an incumbent because they would have been off the council for 2 years. So this is a lot to go into, and it's a lot to consider even when you're just looking at 2 or 3 scenarios. But I did want to mention that this is an issue that's out there should you go forward with a district map. And all of the maps, every single one of the maps before you, has at least 2 council members paired in one district. There's no map that has each council member in a separate seat. So next section, I was going to jump into alternative voting systems. Any questions on the districts before I go off into that?
Any questions? Councilmember Devine? I want to miss you.
Thank you, no.
Guess we can go on.
Okay. Oh, and the last note on the draft district options, in many cases, it's possible to take parts of one and parts of another. One of the things we talk about a lot in the public forums and we mentioned at the hearings is, residents who submit maps usually focus a lot on their key area that they're really focused on, and then they just kind of scribble in and population balance the rest. And you can see that in some of the maps, where there's really finely tuned, carefully drawn lines in part of the city and then kind of random looking lines elsewhere. So if you decide to narrow down to a couple of maps, then one thing you can ask for is, can we clean this area up? Or can we take this part of this map and that part of this map and combine them? So that's all part of what could be requested and discussed if you do go down that road. But let me jump into alternative voting systems, main focus for today. So we're going to discuss essentially the same ones that Ms. Leone mentioned, just taking a different look at them, a different angle. We're looking at the current system, which is citywide or at-large elections. The by-district option we just talked about. I'll talk about that a little bit in the context of these considerations. Ranked choice voting has various names that has been referred to in different places. It used to be called instant runoff. There's ranked choice voting, there's single transferable vote. They all fall into a kind of a bucket of ranked choice voting. Cumulative voting, limited voting, and approval voting that Ms. Leone mentioned. I'll cover all of these. Things I'm going to cover and touch on for each of these is a little bit at the end of the cost to the city to run an election. Each of these systems has a different cost impact on the city actually conducting an election. Cost to the candidate to run. One of the big appeals of by-district elections is that because there's a much more focused geographic area and smaller voter count, that it becomes much less expensive for a candidate to run for office. So I'll go into each of these systems and how that relates to the cost for the candidate. I'll show you a little bit of ballot design so you get a sense for what that involves. One of the key questions that comes up is how many votes does each voter get? And how much say does each voter have in the makeup of the whole council? So go through that, how the votes are counted a little bit. We talk about one part that's often excluded is the campaign dynamics. Every campaign is unique. All of you have been through many campaigns. You know that that's very true based on who's running and the specifics of a given year. But there are certain systematic variables that influence how campaigns happen. So I'll talk a little bit about what each election system does in terms of of campaign dynamics, and then how those systems can or cannot improve the voting strength of protected classes or minority voting blocks within the city. So first, the city's current system, at-large or citywide elections, really simple. When you've got an election coming up, you just list the candidates, you tell the voters, vote for 3 if there's 3 seats up, or 2 if there's 2 seats up, and the 3 candidates who get the most votes win. Really, really easy. Excuse me. By district, also pretty easy. Only the voters in a given district get to vote. They just vote for one, and you just fill in the circle for the one person you're voting for. It does lead to questions sometimes because obviously only 3 of the seats or 2 of the seats are up in a given year, so the rest of the city's not voting. So you do get, the first time there's a by-district election, you end up with either 40% or 60% of the voters calling the clerk's office and say, why isn't the council election on my ballot? It's like, well, you only vote every other election cycle when you go to by-district elections.
I have a question, Doug.
Yeah.
In this type of district election system, you can also apply these different electoral approaches, right? Ranked choice. I mean, because you're still getting the issue here, unless we have a runoff and a general, or a primary and a general, you're getting, you could get somebody with less than 50%.
Yes.
Winning, often you will, right? And you'll get that kind of gaming that happens when, well, I kind of like this person, but I don't think they're going to win, so I'm going to vote for this person because I think they have a better chance of winning. So you could apply any of these systems to districts, right?
You're exactly right. And actually, the first 4 cities in California to go to ranked choice voting did exactly that. Berkeley, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Leandro all have ranked choice voting within districts.
Within districts.
So yes, you're exactly right. It could be, instead of vote for one, it could be rank them.
And would all the other systems that you're going to go through also potentially apply to a district scenario?
You would have to get into a multi-member scenario. So with cumulative voting or limited voting or something like that, there has to be multiple seats up.
I see.
And so if you're only electing one person, like a district traditionally only elects one person, then those wouldn't apply. It would just be ranked choice. Or you could do approval voting in that system too. It's unlikely to work very well because everyone knows they're only electing one person. But you could do approval voting if you wanted to. But ranked choice is typically the add-on that you see with districts,
Yeah.
because it does take care of the spoiler candidate issue and wasted vote issues and those kinds of issues. Makes a lot. It's also ranked, I'll talk a little bit about this, but ranked choice when you're doing it for just one seat, like in a district or for mayor or for city clerk or anything like that, where there's just one spot elected, ranked choice is pretty easy and pretty simple. It's the ranked choice, the single transferable vote, or something called proportionate ranked choice voting, where you're electing multiple people. That's where the system, the counting system, gets really complicated. So in a by district system, ranked choice is a much simpler system to both educate the voters on for them to understand.
But in either case, the county at the moment is not supporting ranked choice, either in a district scenario or in an at-large scenario, right?
Correct. Yeah, the county voting machines don't count by ranked choice.
Yeah. Thanks.
Approval voting I just mentioned. It's not used in any California jurisdiction. It's an interesting idea where it's, vote for everyone who's acceptable to you. And so it kind of keeps out the outlier. The idea is it keeps out the outliers. It eliminates the spoiler candidate issue because you can vote for everyone who you like. You're not splitting your vote. And you just vote for as many of the candidates as you want. And the county just counts up the votes and reports it, and whoever ends up with the most votes wins. If it's the 3 seats open, the 3 top vote getters win. The idea kind of is pretty straightforward. It's vote for everyone that you could live with, more than vote for who you like. Ms. Leone and I looked at some literature on this. It pretty rapidly evolves into the voters understanding what's going on and becomes just like a vote for 3 or vote for 2. Very few voters choose to vote for extras because they realize they're kind of wasting their votes if they do that. But it is an available system, and the county could do it. They could implement it because it is just fill in the circles for everyone you like, even if it's more than 3. But what has been found is that rarely actually happens. The voters tend to focus just on the number of seats open. But it is an available system if you want to do.
So that's something we could implement, and the
Yes.
county could support. I guess this is a question for Marguerite, which is, would that give us kind of a safe harbor for a while we test out whether this helps with dilution?
I'll come back to that of what these systems do. It actually doesn't do anything to help minority voting blocks elect. What it really does is it prevents an extremist candidate from getting elected, but it doesn't. It doesn't numerically help a minority group, be they an ethnic group or just a political minority group.
So it wouldn't reduce legal risk. It wouldn't take care of
No,
the issues that we're facing with CVRA.
correct. Yeah, the appeal here is that if there's like 5 or 6 mainstream candidates and there's one extreme candidate, in some systems, that one extreme might get elected with only 15% of the vote. That wouldn't happen in an approval voting system because the voters, in theory at least, would vote for all of the mainstream candidates. Limited voting is an interesting option. It's very similar to our current system in that everyone appears. It's a citywide vote. All the names appear. But even if there are 2 or 3 seats up for election, you only cast 1 vote. And so in this way, it kind of guarantees the political or ethnic minority group, if they're at a certain enough percentage, that threshold of exclusion that I'll talk about next, a seat, because the majority group kind of divides up its votes among the majority preferred candidates, and that political or ethnic minority group can concentrate its votes on one. So it does work if you hit that threshold of exclusion. It does tend to cause friction because voters say there are 3 seats up, why can I only cast 1 vote? Or there are 2 seats up, why can I only cast 1 vote? And it does lead to overvoting. You know, the instructions have to be very clear that you only get to vote for 1, even though the city's electing 2 or 3. And so people will still mark 2 or 3 circles, kind of in protest, or because they don't understand. And then that ballot is invalid completely. And none of those votes would be counted. So it's an option that's out there. It's not used in California in any jurisdictions. But that does bring up this threshold of exclusion. And so Ms. Leone talked about the formula. The way to think about it is if there are 3 seats up, once a candidate gets 25% plus 1, they're elected. Because if 3 candidates get 25% plus 1, you're at about 76% of the vote, and no one else can get 25%. So it takes a little bit of like thinking through the numbers, but the threshold exclusion would be 25%. You get elected the moment you cross that threshold with 1 more vote. Because if 3 people have 25% and 1 vote, no one else can get 25%. And that's how the math works out. If there are 2 seats up, similarly, the threshold is 33%. You get elected with 33% plus 1, because once 2 people have 33% plus 1, nobody else can get that number. Another 33% plus 1 would take you over 100%, which is impossible. So that's where the idea of this comes from, that you no longer need a majority of the vote as you would in a runoff-based system. You simply need to cross that threshold to get 1 of the seats that's available if you're using limited voting or cumulative voting. Both of them, the math works out the same on both of those systems. So that's a threshold exclusion. The idea. Oh.
In those scenarios, what happens in the event of a tie? If there's there's 2 seats and there's 3 candidates, one gets high number, but then 2 of them get the exact same number.
It'd be the same as in any election.
Flip?
Yeah, I don't know what the system is here. Yeah,
It's a coin
flip or whatever.
Sadly.
Yeah.
All right.
So,
Thought so. Thanks.
yeah. Yeah, I'm working with a.
All right, what happens if 3 people are tied, though, then?
Motion vote.
Yeah, exactly.
And what do you have, a bracket system?
Some of them have high card draw by lots.
Okay, all right.
I'm working now with the school district that in the last presidential election, or no, in the 2022 election had 60 votes cast, and they're going to go to a district election system. Like, you only have 60 voters casting ballots. They're going to have ties if they ever have enough candidates to have a contested election. But yes, it comes up, but the odds are really low in a city the size of Glendale. But it does happen. So if you have a voting block that's over that line and they vote cohesively, keep in mind all these analyses and mathematical analyses assume cohesive voting by that political block. It could be Latinos, it could be renters, it could be people who want a park in a certain part of the city. It could be whatever that political group is. If they're a minority of the total voting population, we're assuming cohesion amongst them, that they all vote together. The formulas can be studied for how much crossover voting there is, and so then you can get into a little bit of not perfect 100% cohesion, but you still need a cohesive block to make these systems work. And so they do get, essentially, if you, as a block, can be 25% plus 1 with 3 seats up, or 33% plus 1 with 2 seats up, under those limited voting or cumulative voting, if you vote as a block, you're guaranteed to elect 1 person. Now, by doing that, you're single shot voting. When there are, especially cumulative voting, there are multiple seats up. And so essentially the group is, what those systems are designed to do is get that group a seat at the table. They'll be a minority, of the voices at the table, but they will have a seat at the table. And that's where these threshold of exclusion numbers come from. And that's also actually where the district elections idea comes from, is to get the smaller voting block a seat at the table. The danger, of course, in districts is that you then, this does, as you've seen in Glendale, this doesn't really happen because the populations aren't that concentrated. But in traditional voting rights situations where the Latino or other group is concentrated, you elect from that district, but all the other districts no longer have to answer to that group of voters. And so it does have a trade-off, certainly in that respect of dynamics once you're actually at the table on the dais running the city. So we have the threshold of voting, or threshold of exclusion and cumulative and limited voting. It does assume that the voters act strategically and cohesively. You can get into a mess where the majority voting block also consolidates around one candidate. And then you only have 2 candidates running. So then someone would come through and slip through as the 3rd seat if there were 3 seats up. Especially in limited voting, all these scenarios assume that the majority group in the jurisdiction is picking 2 or 3 candidates. If the groups truly think strategically, they'll actually write off the seat that the minority group's going to get. So if there are 3 seats up, they'll write off 1 and just run 2 candidates. Because if you run 3, you run into a problem where essentially if the majority group is running 3 candidates, it sort of ends up being a coin toss because they're sort of running as a slate, but one of them is not going to get elected, and it's almost a random draw of which one is not going to get elected. So it gets very weird if the majority group doesn't also think strategically and write off one of the seats. Now, it's hard to write off a seat when there's only 2 up, right? But that is one of the challenges for voting blocks in the city to figure this out. Proportional ranked choice voting or single transferable vote, it is a system that's been come up with for multi-seat elections. So electing 3 council members citywide, for example. And so it establishes that same threshold of exclusion. Once you hit that 33% plus 1 or 25% plus 1, you've got your seat as a candidate. And so in ranked choice voting, what we all think of historically and what the cities that use it in a by-district system do is if no one gets a majority, the last place candidate is eliminated, and the people who voted for that last place candidate, their votes go to their second place candidate. And so it slowly narrows, that's why they call it an instant runoff. The last place candidate gets eliminated and those votes get tallied up until one person gets a majority. In this case, we're looking for not a majority, but we're looking for that threshold of exclusion. We're looking for that 33% or 25%. Now, a candidate could very well get that percentage right off the bat. If you need 33%, you get 36%, boom, you're elected on the first round. But you now have what they call excess votes. And so in the proportional or single transferable vote, those extra votes now get reallocated first. Before you eliminate the last place candidate, you reallocate the 3% extra vote. And it gets this is where the math gets funky. But essentially, if you need 33% and you get 36%, you have 3% extra vote. So 1/11th of every vote was extra. And so for everyone who voted for you, their second place choices get 1/11th of a vote. And you add that up and see if that gets anyone over the threshold of exclusion. If not, then you eliminate the last place finisher and allocate their votes as you would normally. And so that's where these systems get really funky and wacky, is when you're getting 1/11th of a vote and 1/16th of a vote, those kinds of things getting allocated. And of course, this is why it's hard for the county to implement. You have to figure out each person that voted for the successful candidate, who was their second choice, because it's going to vary for every voter, right? And give 1/11th of a vote to each second choice of everyone who voted for that candidate. So the programming is really hard. If you followed, and programming of these systems generally is hard. If you follow the Oakland School Board race, they actually they certified the wrong winner in a ranked choice voting system. And it was such a close election. One of the things you have to determine when you set these systems up and the rules that the county wants is what happens if in the vote for one candidate, you leave it blank and you only vote for second, third, and fourth place. Do all of the votes get shifted up one? So your second place choice becomes your first place choice and so on? Or do you ignore that and it only kicks in the second round? And it's a setting that the county registrar has to set. And in Oakland school board race, they set it wrong. And they didn't move, if you left the first candidate column blank, they didn't move the second choice up. And that difference was enough to decide who won the election. And so after certification, this problem was found out, and it was a big, big mess because once you certify the winner. So these systems are really complicated to program. They're really complicated to implement, and they can be complicated for the voters to understand. On the plus side, they do eliminate the spoiler candidate scenario. You know, they let voters rank all the candidates if you wish to. And so they have a lot of advantages in those systems, in those aspects, but they do have this complicated side to them when you're trying to use them citywide. And that's, so Albany up in Northern California has just started. They held their first election using single transferable or proportional ranked choice voting. They're big fans of it. Ms. Leone mentioned it was part of their CVRA challenge settlement. Palm Desert used it in their last election, but what they had not really understood is that in a ranked choice voting system, even if there's 2 or 3 seats up, you still only get 1 vote. And they hadn't really grasped that until their election came up. So where you want to, if there are 3 seats up, you know, residents want to say, I voted for 3. Well, in ranked choice, only one vote counts. Now, you might get 1/11 of your vote counting for your second place candidate, that kind of thing. So you might get a little bit of fraction for the others. But that's what Palm Desert discovers, like, oh, we get to rank the 3 or 4 we like, but only the first vote counts. And so they actually are in the process of going to full district elections and getting rid of the single transferable vote system in Palm Desert. And that's why, is they were thinking that ranked choice voting allowed you to vote for 2 or 3 if there were 2 or 3 seats up. But you can't do that. That's why these systems succeed at electing the political minority group, is that they cut off the number of votes that the political majority group gets. And so that's how all these systems give a voice to that political minority group, is by not letting the majority vote for all the seats, whether it's through limited voting, ranked choice voting, or whatever system you're using. So a lot of pluses, certainly. A complicated system, and the proportional ranked choice voting, the county can't implement it at this time. They're waiting for all those rules to come down. That does get me to cumulative voting and what is coming back to how the ballot looks. In a traditional cumulative ballot voting system, it's really simple. You have 3 votes. There would actually be a first choice, second choice, third choice header on this as well, but I have a very simplified version of it here. You'd mark 1 in the first column, 1 in the second column, and 1 in the third column. That's a traditional cumulative voting. Again, LA County can't do that yet. They would have to program their system to set that kind of system up. But it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple to understand once it is set up. The workaround that's possible now for cumulative voting is the same idea, but you split the election up into, if there are 3 seats up, into 3 elections. And so you have 3 council elections on the ballot with the same candidates listed for each one. And you say something like cast your first vote, cast your second vote, and cast your third vote. And you have to explain that it could be the same person you vote for all 3 times. Obviously, the fear is the voters will think it's a typo. And the worst part is that the voters you're trying to empower through this system are traditionally the lowest information voters, lower turnout populations. And so they're most likely to be confused. So that is the challenge, and it's a significant education effort to explain this is what you're going to see. And then the reason this works with the county is the county just treats this as 3 different elections that just happen to have the same candidates, but they don't care about that. And they would actually report back to you the 3 elections that then the council in its official certification would add up and to decide who wins. So this is the way that cumulative voting can be done now in the LA County election system. It does work. It does, if the voters understand what's happening, it does implement that cumulative voting system. It gets you the threshold of exclusion if the groups meet that level. And it gets that empowerment for groups that meet that level.
Could you just go back to the last slide and explain why? So in this scenario, if I could vote for pizza across the board, I could give 3 votes to pizza, or I could give 2 to pizza and 1 to hamburger. Any
Exactly.
combination I want. Now,
Exactly.
and why can't this be done today in this simple way?
The LA County voting system can't set up the ballot to look like this and then count those votes. So they can't show 3 columns of circles. They show a candidate and a circle. And that's what LA County does. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bad-mouthing the county at all. One of the challenges is, as you may know, LA County had this 9-year project with a massive public engagement campaign of I don't know, Councilman Kazakian probably knows better than I do, but I think they had 150 community groups involved in developing this system. And so to change it, they then have to go back to those 150 community groups and work through all that system and make sure all the disability allocations, all that stuff. So it's because they had this enormously public process that it takes them a very long time. They can't just call it the programmer and have them redo it like Alameda did. So yes, it's pretty straightforward, but they can't, there's no flexibility to make small changes in the LA County system. It is what it is until they do a wholesale overhaul.
And is anyone in LA County using cumulative voting in the second scenario, the way you've laid it out?
No.
No, nobody's doing it.
Yeah. We have an interesting situation where Redondo Beach has voted to go to ranked choice voting. And Redondo Beach runs its own elections.
When you say, I'm sorry, has voted, the public or the council?
That's a good question. I think the voters voted for it, but I'm not 100% on that.
Can we get confirmation on that? Because it's a big difference.
Yeah, and actually, as Ms. Leone mentioned, it's a charter city. Because these options are only available to charter cities, so it would have had to been a charter amendment. Yeah, so it would have been the voters.
But they run their own election?
So they run their own elections, and they have not consolidated their elections. They're one of the very few holdouts that still does not have consolidated elections with the state.
So who runs their elections? Do they pay the county to do it?
No, they actually kind of run it in-house, which is a little bit of a, duct tape and a hammer approach. You remember there used to be a firm that all the
Martin
cities
and
that
Chapman,
non-consolidated
sure.
elections hired. That firm is out of business.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of them kind of floating around that do individual consulting work, and you have to go get, essentially, they rent the machines from Alameda County or somewhere else that the machines are certified to do these alternative voting systems, drive them down, and hold their election. So you can't do it on a consolidated election day because Alameda is using its machines on election day. You can only do it on your own election day. And so they're looking into this and trying to figure out, they voted to do it whenever they can figure out how to do it. But we'll see. But they have the big issue of they have non-consolidated elections. It came up when we discussed this in Burbank of, well, couldn't we run our own council election on the consolidated day? Long Beach used to do that. And it's a huge nightmare because your voters have to know to go to 2 precincts. They have to go vote twice because it's 2 totally separate elections. And if you think it's hard to get the word out now and hard to get people to vote now, imagine to get them to vote for 2 different elections that may be at 2 different polling places. So that's not recommended. So there are various, one of the views of California and our thousands and thousands of local governments is people are kind of trying a little bit of everything. And Redondo's trying to figure out how to do that, but they haven't figured it out yet. But that's what they'll probably end up doing is keeping their off-cycle elections, which has its own issues of low turnout, of course. So that's cumulative voting. Ranked choice voting, you just number them. You number the candidates. If there's 5, some of the voting systems do have a limit on how many the system can handle. So, if San Francisco has one of its 15 candidate elections, you can only rank the top 10. They may be up to 15 now. I don't know the exact number. Early on, the early ranked choice voting systems, you could only rank 3. But those have almost all been replaced with more up-to-date systems now that allow you to rank at least 10. And then you count those votes. And one of the things we've seen that's interesting is in some cases, you still get an outright winner. someone gets a majority of the vote on the first ballot, none of the ranked choice counting has to happen. They got 52% right off the bat. That one's easy. I don't know about the last election, but up until I think 2020, the issue that these cities ran into was the candidates weren't getting a majority of votes cast. They were getting a majority of ballots that still had valid votes on them. And so they might get 40% of the, so if there's 1,000 people voting, at the end of it, the winner would get 400 votes, but would be called a majority because 200 of the ballots would have run out of valid options at that point. And so if you rank, because even though you can rank 10, people often only rank 5. It's kind of like approval voting. You only rank the ones that you might want winning. So you do get into these strategic considerations, and it doesn't entirely live up to the make sure that the winner gets a majority of the votes. In fact, most of the time, they still don't get a majority of the actual votes cast. They just get a majority of the remaining live ballots. So this is part of the issue. If there's no perfect system, every system has its pluses and minuses. But the ranked choice ballot is really, really simple because it is just a list of names, and instead of circles, you get boxes. And you either just write a number in there, or in some cases, it looks like the cumulative voting one. Mark your first choice, mark your second choice, but that's less effective because if there's 10 choices, that's a lot of columns you have to choose. And I already covered this, so I'll keep through it. The traditional RCV or traditional ranked choice voting, where you're just electing one person, much, much simpler. That's that you just knock off the last place candidate. Those votes get counted for their second choices until someone gets up to 50% plus one of the unexpired ballots. And then this, just to reaffirm, the proportional RCV, where you are using the multiple seats, you do get that threshold of exclusion. That's why there are advocates for it as a solution to CVRA, is that if the population meets that threshold of exclusion, then mathematically they're guaranteed, assuming full polarization, or if you figure in the math of crossovers. Okay, so that's kind of a lot of information throwing at you about these different election systems and the big picture and the theoretical picture. Talking about Glendale, Latinos are 17% of the citizen voting age population, as you've heard many times. That is well below the 25% threshold. And so you do run into an issue of the cumulative voting, limited voting, ranked choice voting. If we had full polarization, would not elect. It would not achieve the goals of the California Voting Rights Act. To get the threshold low enough that 17% would elect, you have to have all 5 or 6 seats up at once. So you'd either have a 2-year council term, or what would generally happen is you'd keep the 4-year council term, but the whole council would be up. And you'd only have an election every 4 years. This also solves the district issue of, well, why aren't I voting? Because you're in the wrong district. Your district elects in 2 years. If everyone votes at once. So I just worked with Jacksonville, Florida, and they actually use this system where the whole council's all up at once. And so that gets it up over the threshold. That would get you up over the threshold of exclusion. But obviously it leads to big governance issues. One of the biggest things that happen is it means you could have the entire council turn over with some regularity. Every 4 years, you could have an all-new council, and that eliminates any of the kind of in-house knowledge or experience that you get with a staggered system, which is why all the California jurisdictions today have staggered systems. It also can lead to one scandal, and boom, everyone's gone. If a scandal hits at the wrong time, and the voters want to toss out the throw the bums out mentality, then everyone's gone instead of just half the council being gone at a given time. And at 15% of citizen voting age population, Asian Americans don't reach the threshold of exclusion until all the seats are up. And it would have to be 6 seats, so they wouldn't reach it at 5. So cumulative voting, limited voting don't achieve the California Voting Rights Act goals unless you put the whole council up on the ballot all at once. There are issues of crossover voting that would reduce that threshold if there's a tendency to crossover vote. But the problem for limited voting and cumulative voting is it tends to eliminate crossover voting. So in our current election system, maybe you have a favorite candidate and a second favorite candidate that if you're in the majority voting block, You vote for the two of them, well, you still have a third vote. So, okay, I'll throw it to, someone who happens to be in the scenario where there are these ethnic voting blocks, the Latino voting block. So because you can't cast all 3 votes for your favorite candidate, you have these extra votes that might lead to more crossover voting. When you go to cumulative voting, the candidates are pushing, cast all 3 votes for me, cast all 3 votes for me. And so that really reduces crossover voting, and that's why the idea of can crossover help you meet the threshold exclusion is you would have to look at it over a couple election cycles, but it's unlikely to help in a big way. And under limited voting, it would essentially eliminate it because you're only voting for one. So it would have to be people are in the majority ethnic group, but whose preferred candidate is the same candidate as the Latino or Asian American or whatever CVRA group we're talking about. So that's a challenge, is that for cumulative voting and limited voting and proportionate ranked choice voting, we would not meet in Glendale that threshold of exclusion unless the crossover numbers hit that level, or we put all the seats up at once.
I'm sorry, which ones would not meet the threshold?
None of them would. So cumulative voting, limited voting, proportionate ranked choice voting would not meet the threshold.
But they would give a better chance
Yes.
than at-large voting.
Yes. Yes. And that's true. They would increase their voting strength and give them a better chance, without a doubt. And this is one of the things of that Santa Monica decision is it's entirely focused on dilution of the ability to elect. They specifically say in the Santa Monica case, the question of an influence vote is not an issue in the Santa Monica case, and so they're not ruling on that. So this could be something that comes up to the court later on in an influence situation. Just a quick few final notes. Voting dynamics. This is the issue of how many do you vote for and what are the campaign dynamics. At large elections, everyone gets to vote for as many seats as they're up, so voters tend to like that. It does have the danger of spoiler candidates and wasted votes, which are a problem in voting theory. It does, as I just mentioned, have more crossover voting. A lot of the effort on the campaign side is actually before the campaign starts. Because of that spoiler candidate issue, there's a lot of work that goes into who's running and trying to keep different people out of the election or convince who's going to run this time, who's going to wait 2 more years to run. Because of and that's a systematic effect of at-large elections. Candidates tend to get along to a point. You see this a lot when there's one open seat, where if there's 3 seats up and there's 2 incumbents running, you get a lot of newcomers saying, hey, these 2 are great, they've been doing a great job, I want that open seat. So candidates do tend to get along because they can run, they can say they're running for the open seat when there's not a full slate of incumbents coming. They can't, I see your face. They can, doesn't mean they do, they can get along. Then the systematic pressure is less for them to go at each other. But if the majority voting block votes as a block, that majority voting block is going to control the whole council. Every seat's going to go to that block, which is why there is the CVRA and questions about this. The last point there, we do see bullet voting working. I've referred to this majority block, but as you know, there are really many, many blocks of voters, right? Some of them loosely align in a given year, some don't. And so there are certainly situations in at-large election systems where a minority group slides through by cohesively backing one candidate while the majority block backs 5 or 6. Or, it's not that long ago, Glendale had, 14, 16 people running for office. In those cases, you could win as a small block to get your candidate up, even in an at-large system. Approval voting. It's interesting because the voters don't have to vote. They don't have to limit their votes. They can vote for everyone they like. The challenge is that you kind of waste your votes if you vote for everyone. So you're going to vote. The idea of the system is you'd vote for all but the extremists, all but 1 or 2 of them. But as a candidate, you want to be elected. And so the candidate dynamics tend to be, don't vote for anyone else, just vote for me. Focus your votes on me, or at most vote for 2 if there's 2 seats up, or 3 if there's 3 seats up. Don't waste your vote by voting for too many, because otherwise you're kind of just accepting a random roll of the dice. okay, there's 5 of us who are not extremist candidates, there's 3 seats up, we're kind of got, under the theory of approval voting, you're kind of rolling the dice for which of the 3 get elected, and a candidate doesn't want to do that. So candidate dynamics tend to be more against the system, pushing voters. You can vote for 5, but don't. Only vote for me or only vote for 2 or 3. So limited elections, it is little used. It's not used in California. Essentially the dynamics and the math and the empowerment of it are the exact same as cumulative voting. But it has the added negative of the voters are very clear that there are 2 or 3 seats up and they only get to vote for 1, and voters hate that. And so that's why people are talking more about cumulative voting than limited voting, is you still get to give the voters 2 or 3 votes if they're in cumulative voting. Both these systems do push the candidates to fight with each other. It becomes, in limited and in cumulative, it becomes vote for me. We might be from the same, we might both be the Chamber of Commerce candidates, but he's a bum, vote for me. And so it does lead to more negative, more contentious campaigns, and they're both limited and cumulative. And this is one of the interesting trade-offs. As we see people pushing for cumulative voting because it does have the empowerment strength that ranked choice brings, it does empower that minority group. But it has the opposite effect. Cumulative voting forces cast all 3 for me, and the rest are all bums. Ranked choice voting, I sometimes refer to as kumbaya voting. It systematically encourages all the candidates to get along. This other candidate's fantastic. If you love this candidate, vote for this candidate number 1. Vote for me number 2. And so you're appealing to all the supporters of all the other candidates. So it's a very positive campaign dynamic that comes out of ranked choice voting, because no one wants to attack anyone because you want everyone else's supporters to vote you number 2. So it's very good for campaign dynamics, very much more positive campaigns, much more positive candidate forums. The flip side of this, and all these things have a plus and negative to them. This is why in San Francisco, a supervisor got elected who had to leave office because he was convicted of being a slumlord, and turned out he didn't live in the city of San Francisco. Many people knew that, but they knew he had a big voter block, and if they called him out, his supporters wouldn't vote for them number 2. And so literally no one told the press about it, and this guy was elected. His last name was Lee. He was removed about 8 years ago from San Diego supervisor. And so that positive side definitely is a good thing and leads to a much more positive atmosphere. But in the absence of a strong independent media covering these elections in depth, doing their own investigations, it can also lead to limited information for the voters because no one is sharing that information. Now, when I raise that, I often get the comment about, well, what about all these independent campaigns that come out in most of these cities? And yes, that's entirely true. The odds are you'd probably get an independent campaign, but most of the independent campaigns are in some way tied to 1 or 2 or 3 of the candidates. And so they're reluctant to do that. Maybe not, tied is the wrong word. They're supporting 1 or 2 or 3 of the candidates. And so they're reluctant to do that. So it does have this good, positive atmosphere, and everyone kind of, candidate forums become more workshops for ideas, and that's a great idea, I want to work with you on that. But it also does have that downside to it of limiting the information that campaigns usually provide on the other candidates. Then the other piece is that part I mentioned before about really only 1 vote counts. You might get 1/11 of your vote that goes on to your second choice, but you really only casting 1 vote, even when there's 2 or 3 seats up. But it does have that empowerment factor for groups that are large enough to cross the threshold of exclusion. And then just very briefly, campaign costs driven by 2 factors. The size of the electorate, how many voters do you as a campaign need to send mail to or call to or do all that outreach to? And then the size of the appeal. How large of an audience do you need to reach out to in order to get elected? At large is the most expensive because you're really shooting at pretty much the whole city. Proportional ranked choice voting, it's still citywide elections, but you start to target your supporters a little bit more because you're not going for everyone who might cast you as one of their 3. You're really going for, who am I going to convince to be number 1 on their ballot? Cumulative voting is very similar. The top four are all very similar in expense, but slightly less. We go to cumulative. Limited voting is the least expensive of the citywide systems because you're only going for people who are definitely going to vote for you, number one. If you're their second choice, third choice, fourth choice, you're going to write them off. You're just trying to get to the ballot, get to the voting booth. Those who think you're the best of all the candidates. And then by district, obviously much smaller voter audience, greatly reduces the price of contacting them and of filing your candidate statements. And then by district with traditional ranked choice voting, as you're talking about, brings the price down even more because you're kind of piggybacking with other candidates in the campaign. But every campaign is unique. Just because it makes it possible to run a campaign on a lower budget doesn't mean people will. People still come out with all the money they can, of course. And then similarly, the cost of the city of running an election is driven by the size of the electorate, the length of the ballot, and the complexity of the vote counting. So poor Palm Desert, being the only city in Riverside County using ranked choice voting, they had to pay the whole subscription fee of the software add-on that could count the ranked choice voting ballots. It's $70,000 a year, every year, for the software subscription, and pay for the additional manpower needed for the complexity of that, which is the other reason that they're going to pure districts, is that cost. But you do, again, most expensive cumulative with that workaround, where you have the election listed 3 times because you're running 3 elections. In the county's eyes, it's 3 different elections. So that's more expensive than just one citywide election. Proportional ranked choice is still citywide, but it's complicated. Cumulative voting with a traditional ballot is a less complicated, but still citywide. And then at large and limited are really simple. The county, those are really easy for the county. But then you get a big drop in price because only 40% or 60% of the city is voting in a given year if you're by district or by district with ranked choice. So that's a lot of information. Sorry about the fire hose approach to this, but hopefully useful. I've mentioned this before, but again, the key things right now, the county can run at large, limited, by district approval, or the workaround cumulative voting. The county right now cannot, and for years won't be able to run traditional cumulative voting, single box, or any form of ranked choice voting until they get to that point. That's it. And then I got some links in here.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear from, we can give you a break.
Mr. Mayor, just brief, I apologize. I think Ms. Leone is going to have to sign off to join a closed session for another jurisdiction. So I don't know if you have council has any further questions for her on the legal side before she does.
All right, we'll see. Does anybody have any more questions for Marguerite? No? Okay.
All right.
It is nice talking to you all.
Excuse me. So we have 2 speakers. We have no one on the phone. Is that right? Okay. Let's hear from our 2 speakers, and then we'll take it from there. So we'll start with Karen Kwok.
Well, I'm sorry, is Ms. Leone gone?
Yeah.
Did she just sign off?
She just, oh,
Okay. Well, if I can ask the city attorney to maybe convey this information, this question to her, maybe she can find out, since she is a foremost expert in this. I'm curious to know how many cities are currently being sued for this process? And separately, how many cities are in the process of moving to districts right now? I know a few were mentioned in the presentation.
You can get that information. And, actually, Dr. Johnson probably knows.
All right, as long as someone can provide that information to me accurately.
oh, I see, she's here, actually.
Oh,
Okay.
Excuse me, I was just searching for the sign-off button.
I apologize, Ms. Leone, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm happy to answer it. I know right now the city of Cypress is in a lawsuit. Santa Monica is still in a lawsuit. City of Ontario is up on appeal, and the city of Burbank has just been sued. Doug, are you aware of any others at this point?
No, that's the same list.
Okay.
Same list. All right.
Well, all right, thank you very much. I may have I'd like to get a bigger picture of it because those are just a few cities. We know that at least in LA County, there's about 88, 89 cities. So to know how many have been sued in the last 8 or maybe 10 years would be helpful. Sued and also have converted to a different system of elections than the at-large system they had.
We have
probably
access to
have a
that
good-
information. We can get it to you.
All right,
Yeah, we can get that to you. We probably have a good start on it.
thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. All right, sorry about that, Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Kwok, and I would like to thank Dr. Doug Johnson for that fascinating discussion on alternative voting systems. Just yesterday, I heard that the city of Portland, Oregon, is the last remaining city in this country that operates via a mayor-commission form of local government. And that is going to change due to a ballot referendum passed last November. Beginning next year, they're going to vote for 12 council members in 4 districts. Now, that means they're going to actually do a hybrid version of district and at-large elections. They're actually going to vote for 3 at-large candidates in each of 4 districts. Unfortunately, I bounced this idea off Dr. Johnson before this meeting started. He said that that would not be compliant with the California Voting Rights Act. That's unfortunate because a friend of mine suggested that, we could divide Glendale into 2 districts where most people in Glendale would agree they fall North Glendale, north of the 134, and South Glendale, and we could simply pick 3 candidates from the north and 3 candidates from the south. That would actually work for me, but unfortunately that's not going to happen. I also like ranked choice voting, but due to all the reasons cited by Dr. Johnson, it's easy to understand in principle, but very difficult to apply in practice. Not only because of the ballot limitations, but also people have a hard time understanding. They understand the first principle, but again, what happens if this, what happens if that? They have a hard time understanding the rest of that. But there is a form of voting that every voter already understands today. It's the way we already vote for propositions. But whether we have 1 proposition or 10, we can vote yes or no on every single proposition. So if we had 10 candidates running at large for city council, we could vote yes or no for every single candidate. That's regardless of the number of seats up, regardless of the number of candidates. And then we could simply see which candidate has the highest proportion of yes votes to no votes and pick the top 3 winners that way. Now, this would also have the advantage of eliminating extremist candidates, as Dr. Johnson pointed out with approval voting. And considering that we currently have no Speaker of the House in Washington, D.C., it can be a high priority to eliminate the extremist candidates who are basically holding up things not just nationally, but also internationally. And in daily practice, that there are a lot of people who might be a little uncertain of which candidates they want to vote for, but they often have a very clear idea of who they want to vote against. It would be a way to log the no votes. Now, this has a very small chance of passing, but I will always find a way to be weird and different. And finally, I'd like to close with the cost of voting in a ballot initiative in March versus November of next year. That I recall in November 2018, the city did put Measure S on the ballot. That was outside of their regular municipal election cycle. And so the city does find ways to put ballot initiatives even when they do not match up with the regular municipal elections, when they consider it a priority. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just to clarify this yes/no idea, that sounds like approval voting, is it not?
It's much like approval voting, yes. Yeah.
How is it different? It's exactly approval voting. You're voting for yes for as many as you want.
Yeah, and I think the dynamics would be a lot like approval voting, except you'd be more likely to get no's on everyone, kind of thing. So, people feel guilty if they don't vote in an election, so they tend to vote for at least one. But if you're voting yes, no, you could vote no on everybody and feel like you're participating in the election. So, but it's yeah. So it would. The end dynamics are much like approval voting, but it has some specific twist to it, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Herbert Milano, who we haven't seen in a while.
Mayor Broadman, members of the City Council, my name is Herbert Milano. I'll first address the 2 issues before you. I particularly like map 104, which is not population balanced, and I like ranked choice voting. And I'll give that as an expression of my experience in Glendale when I had fictitious candidates, individuals basically being pulled into the voting because I had a Latin name, and they put a couple of individuals who had never attended a city council session, didn't even know where the city council was, because I talked to them and yet their name was on the ballot. I'll address a more important and pertinent issue. We have a population, by and large, that is low information, low turnout, particularly south of the 134 freeway. extremely low information. They don't know how the city runs, they don't know about the decisions, yet they get the impact. The recent situation with the Glendale water and power rates is an example of that. People don't know about the transfers of money that go from the GWP over to the general fund, and the impact that it has on the rate is significant. People are not aware of the thousands of individuals who cannot afford their electricity rates, measured by the number of notices of intention of turning off the electricity that occurs every year. People don't know. What's worse is that candidates don't know. And candidates run for office and have no idea of the finances of the city. So who are the individuals who win? Continually, the ones that are generally best funded and supported by the city unions. And it's invariably, and it is my contention, that the city's fire association are the ones who have generally and exercise the greatest power in terms of how their influence and how their sponsorship assist individuals in running for office. We had it in the past with John Draymond. Failed miserably one year without him, and the next time he ran handsomely. What we don't have is the information required with regard to performance outcomes by district. We don't have the information of how the city is performing with regard to equity and balance to the various different regions of the city. And one example of that is the park impact fees, collected in the most dense parts of the city and yet distributed away from where the need is. Clear and example bias with regard to the way in which the monies are being distributed. It exists in Glendale. So will this process help this out? Will we get candidates who will address this problem? I doubt it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. We've been at this for 2 hours. I need to step away for a break. Can we take just a 5-minute recess?
Sure.
Everybody be
I'm
okay
fine
with
with
that?
that.
And then we'll come back and we'll discuss.
I'm fine with that.
Okay. And then we're going to go into closed session. Okay?
Okay.
All right, so we'll be back at 4:05. Okay, we are back. And before we go on to comments, questions from council members, I'd like, Mr. City Attorney, if you could just tell us where we are in the process, what kind of direction would be useful to get from us today. I know we're not making any decisions, but you could potentially use some direction. That would help focus our discussions.
Sure, and Councilmember Satrin stepped out, but, the council's had 4 public hearings. We had originally scheduled another public hearing for tonight, but obviously it's been pushed off so that we can have this discussion. The intent is if the council's desires to move forward, on November 7th, we bring you back a decision point to introduce an ordinance to adopt a map. And again, that's assuming you direct us to do that, move forward. I think what direction would be useful is if we are moving forward for the 7th, for you to provide Dr. Johnson and staff maybe some parameters on the maps that you'd like us to focus on. If you have questions on maps, if there are some maps, as Dr. Johnson noted, that you like some of the districts, but you think some of those need to be tweaked a little bit, it'd be useful for us to hear that direction so we can bring you back some revised information for the 7th. And in addition, on the 7th, we would bring you back the charter amendment language again, so you can make decisions on that as well, if that's the direction that we're moving.
Okay. Okay, so let's go around and hear from council members' questions, comments. Can we start over here? Councilmember Kasarkian?
I definitely, thank you. I'm glad we had this discussion. I know it may have been a lot for us to take in, but I think it's better to do it while we're still fresh in the afternoon. And certainly, there's a lot to think about here, given the different systems and what we potentially may be facing. Ultimately, I do think that we should allow the voters to decide if they like the proposal of having districts. I think that from the maps that we have, there is a number that I'm okay with, but I would like to hear from my colleagues before expressing it. I mean, there's some that were mentioned here. I mean, 106, 106B, 107, even the one that Mr. Milano brought up, which I believe was 104, with some modifications for balancing the population are fine. What I like about the increase or having an additional council seat and having 6 districts is the fact that we do allow for greater representation for parts of the city that have historically not had representation on the dais. In terms of the different systems that Mr. Johnson brought up, it's clear to me that all of them have challenges that I don't know if we're equipped or if anyone is equipped to adequately address. I am interested in knowing more about what Redondo Beach is doing, though. They're the ones that are running their own election, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions. I did not realize that they were still running their own off-schedule elections. I do recall from my time serving as clerk that I think that one other city that remained, it was any jurisdiction that had a voter turnout in their own standalone election of below 25% had to consolidate with the state for a statewide run election. And I think Palm Springs may have been a city that had 25% or higher for their election turnout. But I don't know what election system they have now. I'd be interested to know whether they consolidated, so I guess my broader question would be, what cities still have standalone elections? Not that that matters, but it matters because of the following. I mean, we can't go back to having a standalone election because we had that approved, and we have now had consolidated elections. To go back to that would be, I think, confusing the voters even more. But why it matters is because there are costs associated with running standalone elections that I would be interested in knowing, as well as the operational details, how they even print ballots or get those certified machines. One of the things that you alluded to that I'd like to know with certainty is when Redondo Beach runs their elections, if they're bringing in voting machines from Alameda County, which is all the way in the northern part of the state, is that true? How long do they anticipate doing that for? What does that contract look like? There's a lot that goes into that because depending on what type of machines there are, they need to be programmed for the type of election that is being held down here. And with their data, who does that? Is it the Alameda County Registrar Recorder staff that does it? Without knowing those details, it's hard for us to say, okay, well, we're going to abandon this process of going towards district elections, which from what Mr. Johnson and the council that the city has hired to guide us, Ms. Leone, have said, the most simple solution to the challenges we face as a city is to go to districts. It seems to be the most straightforward path, and quite honestly, what I believe to be the most equitable path, and also one that we're going to be headed towards anyways at some point. So those are my thoughts. I know my colleagues will have their own, and so I'll leave it to them at this point. Thank you.
I just want to clarify what you're saying. So are you saying you support bringing a map and the charter changes this coming election, March, or
I would be open to either.
March or November?
March or November. I would be fine with either.
Even with the cost?
Increased cost, I think that if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right. If it's being rushed and there's more that we need to do in terms of outreach, I would be fine with spending the money to do the appropriate outreach. But my preference would be to do it in the March election. But if we are not able to come to any clear consensus and we need to engage the public more, I think that money spent in engaging the public is money well spent, especially on a change of this magnitude.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to clarify that. Councilmember Asatryan.
Look, I've always been in support of districts. It's been my position for a very long time. I do feel like this process is being rushed. I think I kicked off this meeting being pretty upset about the community outreach. I think if we're building the future of our city, there has to be a lot more thought and input put into it. The abysmal numbers that I've heard about from the community meetings and the showing up there. There are some maps that I do like. I don't know where the rest of my colleagues are going to be at. I also like, I think some of them, Councilmember Kasakian mentioned, I also like map 125. When I look at, one of the comments I had made, for example, if we're thinking about renters and homeowners, just when I think about my neighborhood, all the way, from Brand all the way to Burbank, there are a lot of neighborhoods that have condos and renters above Glen Oaks, right? And so you're bundling them up in some of these maps, and it really does feel like, people worked on some of the south maps and then just kind of left it, or vice versa. And so I would like to add map 125 to Mr. Kasakian's list.
Well, if we're going to list them, I want to go back and I'll give my full list, but thank you.
Okay. So I would want some answers. I don't know where that leaves us with respect to how some of our community organizations feel about these maps. That includes organizations that represent the various diverse communities, because there's no indication in any of these reports that they participated. I've asked in the briefing that I had if they had. I believe that at the very least for one, I know that someone reached out to them and no one's gotten back. But then when I got the contact information, I recognized it was the wrong office that was contacted that's in charge. So I'd like to work with staff in the next week to put together a better list. You know, when I first got elected, that was one of the first things I asked for Mr. Galanian. I asked for a nonprofit list because I wanted to meet with our nonprofits, and there wasn't one. And I asked again, and I asked again, and here we are a year and a half later, and we're deciding on the future of our city. So, you know, I don't know what that means for November 2nd for me, but I'm feeling very rushed at this, and I'm not feeling very comfortable.
November 7th, okay.
You know, so,
Let me, just to clarify, so what's your view on a March versus a November?
I would be okay with either one.
But I'm hearing you think March is rushed.
I feel like
given-
March is rushed. I'd want to go through a better process than the one that we've had.
Okay,
You know, honestly, I don't know where we're going to land, right? I don't know if these organizations are going to participate. I also recognize that with that also comes, you know, if some of these don't know how this works, it's a very meticulous process, right? And so I can't imagine that just the general public would be able to put these maps together in a way that meets all these requirements. So, you know, and there's also a part of me that's like, okay, well, the reports that's coming back doesn't give the Latino and the API community the voice that they deserve, right? And so I'm very conflicted right now, but I am open to continuing this conversation. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. And I guess Councilmember Kasakian had additional things that he wanted to note, but I do want us to move to districts. I think it's a good thing, but.
Okay,
what
as
those
far as the
districts-
maps go, you mentioned 125, I just kind of
So
want to see.
106, hold on a second.
I think 106B is the cleanup of 106. What's the difference?
Yeah, there's just tiny changes. 106 had the Crescenta Highlands District coming all the way down to Kenneth Village. And so 106B moves that border to be the middle of the hill. So north of the hills and the northern seat, south of it's in the south. And then to balance that, there's a little bit of change where the northwest seat meets the Ross Moyne seat, just to balance it. Very small changes just to clean those things up.
Okay.
Okay.
But
So
that's that's a map that appeals to you.
it does. 120B was also a map that appealed to me. And the 125, most definitely. And then I think one of the comments that I had made during the briefing that we didn't discuss today is, I know we're talking about the Latino and the API community, but since the elections have been consolidated, the voice of the Armenian American community in the election process has also changed. Whereas prior to the consolidation and the 2020 election, the Armenian American community was able to elect with their votes. They are no longer able to do that. And so they become part of a larger pot, but that distinction I think really needs to be made when we're talking about the Armenian American community here, because at the end of the day, they do make up a very big chunk of our constituents. And so I wanted to put that out there as well. Because, you know, if we were looking at previous elections, there is a trend of a difference, right? And how much, I'd also note how much Armenian American candidates have to spend versus non in order to get elected is also a point to be made with these at-large elections.
Okay. Let me go to Councilmember Najarian and then Councilmember Devine.
Well, you know, I appreciate the presentations, I really maintain my strong opposition to districts. There is no doubt in my mind that it is going to create parochialism, it's going to lead to corruption, it's going to lead to the balkanization of our city. I don't think it's needed. I mean, there's many things that we're discussing today. It's only maps, but there are a lot of issues that are packed into this. One is the huge increase in council salaries, which I'm strongly opposed to. Another is the election of a singular mayor for 4 years, which I'm strongly opposed to. There are many questions left unanswered, which I don't know if we will be the ones answering or not. Can someone run for 2 offices at the same time? Mayor and council member? I think that I'm strongly opposed to that. That is absolutely absurd in my mind. I don't trust the numbers. I do not believe that we have 17% Latinos, true Latinos in this community. I think that number is corrupted with many with Latino surnames who are not Latino, perhaps married into the family. I believe it's corrupted with, we went to the Filipino event last night, many of us, and I would, reckon to say that at least 90% of the Filipino community has Latino names. Now they say it's parsed out, but Mr. Johnson himself told us that those numbers aren't that reliable. So I think this whole process is really, is not good for this city. In my opinion, this is not going to pass. The members of the public are not in favor of this. Some questions and some comments. I think currently we do have a de facto limited voting election. When Verge Agajanian gets up and says, vote for one person, many voters only voted for one person, not just in the city council race. They checked Verge, but I think a lot of other races were left blank because they voted for one person, only vote for one. So I think we have that currently, which is I think it's the way that was presented was a corrupting factor in this. And you talk about confusion. Well, Madam Clerk, are we going to have in-person voting for this next election in the precincts, or is it all by mail? We will have in-person.
Yes.
So you want to talk about confusion? Not why do I only get one vote for 3 people running, but where is my candidate? I thought he was running for election. Oh, they marked their vote. Oh, I guess he was on the second page. I didn't see that. I think that is the most confusing factor. That's not a city's problem. That is a problem with the County of Los Angeles. Let's see. Said I don't trust the numbers. Oh, let's talk about the lawsuit. I strongly disagree with our counsel that there's going to be one decision coming up and it's only going to apply to the facts set by the city of Santa Monica. Well, there are going to be certain standards that are going to be enunciated, certain standards that are going to be set. And yes, each city has different facts, but each city is going to apply their facts to those standards. And to say that, well, we don't need to worry about Santa Monica, the Court of Appeal ruling, and it was admitted that it could go back to the Supreme Court, it could get back to the Court of Appeal. This is the biggest change in our government structure that we've had in the city of Glendale since we maybe started televising our meetings. And I think we're rushing into it with the fear that we may have some litigation, but with an uncertain decision by the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, I just think it's something we should sit out, bide our time. I do believe that if we feel that we're at risk, that we proceed with the petition for declaratory relief. I disagree with her that there has to be another party. It's a petition that's made. A petition is made by the city of Glendale asking for a determination of rights of the city. So that's what I feel, and I'm not going to throw out any maps because that would be insincere of me at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Devine?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I think just listening to the discussions of my three colleagues, I'm at the point where I have made the decision. This is a very, very complicated, too many questions. I think I asked when this first was brought up that we pause and we wait for Santa Monica, wait for a decision, take a breath, and then kind of move forward. I have not ever been in favor of districts. I find that I feel they're fiefdoms, and I think, you know, we've already gotten questions in emails about, well, what happens if I want this? Can I go to another council member, et cetera? So again, there's confusion. I think, you know, time is right now the essence if we want to put this on the March ballot. Thank you, Mr. Johnson and Councilor Leone for the briefing today. It only multiplied my thought process, my questions, my ability to make decisions about this process and going forwards with this. I think one of the reasons that we're getting low turnout in our outreach meetings is because, number one, people are not interested. Number two, they don't want it. And I don't know that you're gonna, by inviting more participants or organizations, how much more you're going to get, but you know, it's worth the try, but that's gonna take more time. I really feel we should be putting this off before we make these decisions. I mean, what we heard today in 2 hours was absolutely mind-boggling. As far as the maps go, you know, I would like to see us do 5 districts and be done with it. If we're going to go to districts, do 5 districts, no mayor, no increased salaries, just do 5 districts like the school board and the college board have done. If that's where we're headed, I think that's where we should go. As far as these maps are concerned, I do have some choices, and they actually go right along with Councilmember Satrian's 106B, 120, 125. Those would be my major, I guess, or my choices at this point. However, I just think we're rushing into this. I think we've been rushing since the get-go, and I think it's time to slow down and take a breath and give us more time to research this. How are we gonna vote? I mean, that's amazing. All the different types of voting methods. It's just too complicated, and I think we're rushing into it. And that's my opinion for the day.
Okay, well, thank you. Oh,
Plus, Mayor, we have not discussed what happens if the ballot measure fails. Has anybody discussed that with us? No, I don't remember that conversation. So I think that's another important conversation that we need to have. Thank you, Mayor.
okay, thank you. Did you want, Councilmember Kazakian, you want to hear from me first, or do you?
I would like to hear from you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, so I guess my thoughts on this are, you know, going back to before Councilmember Satrian was on the council, I had come out, and so had Councilmember Kasakian, in favor of districts for a number of reasons, and we've talked about it many times. The cost of running for elections prevents many candidates from even attempting to run that would otherwise be, I think, good council members. I think better constituent services when you have a district and you're focused locally and understand your area, your constituents better. I think it provides better representation, and I've never been only about protected classes, but also socioeconomic representation, I think, is lacking. So those are some reasons why I've favored it. I've never been, you know, of the mind that it's a slam dunk. I think there are pros and cons, and many of the things Councilmember Najarian worries about, I also worry about. But when I weigh the pros and cons, the scale tilts in favor of districts, and it always has for me. And so I've wanted to do this separate and apart from kind of the legal issues. But as time has gone on, I think we've learned about these legal risks. And my view is the only way that we're really going to protect ourselves is by districting. I think that we will ultimately get sued. Whether we can win, maybe we can, maybe we can't. We'll spend a lot of money fighting it for something I don't think is worth fighting. I'm looking at these alternative voting systems. I don't think any of them look particularly appealing, except for ranked choice voting, which we can't do. So my view is we move forward. Now, as far as this question of feeling rushed, I could see us slowing down. I wouldn't want to pause because I would want to continue the outreach and the conversation with the community. So I don't want to pause, but I would be in favor of considering a November initiative. Even though it does cost a considerable amount of money, it is a very important decision for our city. And it does, November 7th does feel rushed. So I would be there as far as.
You meant March feels rushed. You said
No, November 7th for us to
this
pass an
November 7th.
ordinance. Like, this is like, we're talking about 2 weeks from
2
now,
weeks.
right?
That- and-
2
yeah.
weeks from now, us selecting a map and making all these decisions, I can't see how we'll get there.
We could probably push it out another week, but to your point, I think to the point that I'm hearing from the council is that that doesn't give you the time that you're talking about.
I think we're kind of running out of time to get this on the March ballot. And I think there's some benefit for taking a little more time, making sure we are connecting with all the groups that would have an interest in this process and being a little bit more deliberate about it. It gives us a little bit more time to understand some of these legal issues because there could be further developments. So I would be of the view that we're not going to make a decision on an ordinance on November 7th. I think we should slow down, but continue the work. As far as maps go, I'm hearing a lot of consensus. My list, before hearing from anybody else, I'll just tell you, my list was 106B, 120B, 122, 124, and 125. So I see a lot of 106B, 120B, 122, 124, and 125. I see that Councilmember Devine is 106B, 120B, 125. I'm hearing of 106B and 120B and 125 from Councilmember Asatrian, and I think Councilmember Kasakian's list overlaps. So I think what we should do, though, is I don't think we can continue to do outreach with a list of 30 maps or however many we're at now. I really think we should limit it to maybe 2 or 3 maps that we have a consensus around. I think it'll make that discussion much easier for people to get their heads around. So I would like to give some direction if my colleagues are willing and able to try to get down to 2 or 3 maps that we all feel we could live with. Yes.
My only point was going to be, since it seems like there might be some consensus to put this to the November election. We can bring all the maps that you've discussed here today and bring those back to you and have another discussion sometime before the end of the calendar year. If you're not comfortable making a decision today to narrow it down to 3. And we're obviously open to either
I'm
one.
okay with that.
Mayor, if I may recommend, I think it would be worthwhile for us to narrow down, not necessarily come down to 2 or 3. I think within that outreach, if we are going to have more time for these maps to be presented to these different stakeholder groups. I had also mentioned, I think during the briefing, you have a lot of the HOAs listed, right? And we talk about this all the time where, especially with underrepresented communities, they don't tend to be represented within the HOAs. And so I want to make sure that aside from these maps, if there is input as you're having meetings with these stakeholder groups, if they have feedback on this part of this map doesn't work, or these are some things that we're thinking about, that whatever report we get back or whatever study sessions we have, that input is incorporated into the report that we get back as a council. And so I wouldn't want to narrow it down to 2 or 3 right now. I think there's consensus around multiple, but we've narrowed it down from, what was it, 18 maps?
39.
I think
But I am hearing 3 that I think, well, I haven't heard Councilmember Kasakian's
Yeah,
full
so-
list,
so
but I'm
my-
hearing 125, 106B, and 120B.
So-
There are 3 of us so far that are,
I like, I'm fine with 106B. I'm also fine with 107. My rationale for a lot of these is that it does provide it keeps what I believe are communities of interest together, and certain neighborhood associations and neighborhoods that we've come to accept as being unique and distinct. So 106B, 107, 122, 124, and 126. The reason I wasn't crazy about 125 is because the maps that take the portion of, it elongates, like District 6, and I should mention, I can't look at this very closely, but if I zoom in, perhaps I'm in this district, so take this with a grain of salt, although it's not intended to be out of self-preservation. I really don't care one way or another on that issue. Taking the portion of the city that abuts Burbank with what is the commercial equestrian, and having that slip on down or elongated down to the southern portion of the city along San Fernando, it really combines communities that I think have very distinct issues and concerns. Therefore, some of these maps that have that type of a proposal, I'm not entirely in favor of. I think that there's more in common with the people along just north of Glen Oaks with folks who are in that western portion of the city. So that's why I have 106B, 107, 122, 124, 126 are the ones I like. And I like them because at least in a few of these, you have a downtown district, or you have 2 districts, one that brings into it Adams Hill as a neighborhood, and a few other areas. So that's it. And there's a few that, have these odd, I won't refer to it as gerrymandering, but, they kind of have these very thin strips that then pick up a certain portion, which I haven't looked at those very carefully to see why that is, so I left those out. I'm sure that someone had some interest in proposing it that way. But again, those are mine.
okay, may I make, did you want to say
No,
something?
no,
That
that's
I have a
okay. No, no.
recommendation.
I have a recommendation as well.
Okay,
but-
well,
No,
let's
please.
hear it. Well, my recommendation, I'm hearing 125, 106B, 120B, 3 of us are talking about those maps. I hear from Councilmember Kasakian 4 other maps, 107, 122, 124, 126. I had others on my list, but I don't need to maintain them. If my suggestion would be, at least let's circle these 7 maps. Okay, so we've gone from 30 to 7. We're making some progress. And if we have a little bit more time, we can then, we don't have to do it all today. We can do it at a subsequent meeting. That's my suggestion would be, at least let's get down to these 7.
If I can put one piece of framing around this discussion too, keep in mind that this isn't a final decision. Essentially what we're looking for is direction on a handful of maps that we would then put into a flyer that would go to every community group and all that, and say, here are the 3 kind of focus maps right now. But all the rest of the other maps would stay on the website as well, and people could say, so that's the idea, is to get down to hopefully 3 or 4, maybe not today, maybe November 7th, that would then be used in the communication. Say, hey, here are 3 kind of focus maps right now. What do you think? If you don't like a part of it, look at these other 29 maps that are back here as well. So we're not looking, your action does not rule anything out of coming back onto the table later on.
Okay.
It's just trying to focus the discussion for now.
Okay. I feel 7 is still a little much, but I think we're making progress if we can get to 7. Councilmember Asatryan. Did you?
Yeah.
What were you
I
gonna
lost
say?
my chain of thought.
Oh, okay, well, Councilmember Najarian, I'll
Hey,
give you a
listen,
minute to get it back.
let's not slip back to our consultants acting as advocates for the districts, because we did that before. I haven't made any beef lately because it has pretty much ended. But now you're saying let's rev it up again, maybe until November? I got a big problem with that. Even as Mr. Johnson described what's going to be handed to him, in no way did he mention that you don't have to vote for any district. You can vote against districts. So this is, we're back to this advocacy on an issue. The closer we get to adopting a resolution proposition for the districts, the closer we're getting into advocacy. That is not fair to do that. I want anything that comes out to the residents, homeowners, from either the city manager's office, Mr. Johnson, Tripepi Smith, whoever is in there, we have to see that. This has to be balanced. It can't be an advocacy piece. People are going to think, well, this is a done deal. Do I want 106 or 125? How about none of them, right? So it has to be equal time for the none of them part of this that we put towards which map do we want. Unless you guys want to say, let's decide if we want to go to districts in the first place and then do all the outreach, advocacy, map, parsing that you want to. But we can't be advocating for districts with an extended period here. I'm just telling you that. I'm going to go, that's a bright line for me. You saw me very concerned about this before. I'm going to be even more concerned because some might say this is an attempt that realizing that it isn't going to pass the residents' vote. So let's kick it out a little bit more and get another 8 months of campaigning to get the districts in. So I just want to warn everyone. We've got a very careful line that we have to walk here.
Mr. Najarian, I think the concerns you had shared, some of them I had also brought up to staff, and my understanding is that all of that has been cleaned up, right? The language, the language
Yes,
issues.
Council members, I
So
don't
how
have the detail,
does-
but it has been revised from the initial language that was
Okay,
shared.
I just want to be clear that the decisions that we're making today don't change that. So I don't know why you're concerned about this.
I want to make sure that we don't fall back to where we were before. Mr. Johnson's own statement, I'm not going to, I know you're just speaking, but that's the mindset. Which map do you guys want? How about I don't want any map? How about I don't want any districts at all? That should get equal weight in the discussion and the presentation to all those outreach groups that we're looking for.
Is there something that you object to, Councilmember Najarian? I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, let me just ask a question directly to the council member. Is there something that you object to in the way a question is phrased that would say the following? If the city were to go to districts and expand the council, which of these maps would you prefer?
If the city, well, let me start with the first 5 words. If the city were to go, if you vote for a districting plan, there are options and these are possible selections you can make.
Okay.
Or you can advise council, I guess, at this point.
What then is the?
Because we never did it like that before. That's not the way we were doing it. We were selling hotcakes.
We fixed it.
I don't necessarily agree with that, Councilmember Najarian.
Oh,
I know that you will.
I take issue with it.
I am not an attorney, so I am far from being able to sit there and go toe to toe with you on some of the, verbal gymnastics that we will exercise here on the dais. But I think that we are being fairly straightforward with the public.
We
and
weren't
saying
at
otherwise.
first.
No,
until I
I
made that
disagree. No,
audit.
I disagree. I think that we all came to a decision, a collective decision, and we want to give the residents the options. And I think that when, for instance, Council Member Devine says we haven't even talked about what would happen if this was to not pass, I think we've made that abundantly clear that the city then remains liable to go to districts, and just like the school district and the college board, it may be forced to either have 5 districts without a vote and input of the public, right? Mr. Johnson, did the public have an input as to what the districts looked like when the school district and the college district implemented districts?
Yes, so both went through a full public process.
They did? In
Yeah, it
order for
was
final adoption?
for what map would be adopted.
Okay, but was it by a vote of the public?
No.
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah, no, it was with the understanding either through a court order in the school's case or a settlement agreement in the college's case
And
that
so-
there would be a map, but there was a public process on which map.
So the public had input, but ultimately it was the elected body, the representatives, who voted on which map to implement.
Yes.
Okay, so public didn't have as much of a say as they would have had they actually gone to the polls and voted for a map. Correct?
Yeah.
They didn't vote on the maps?
Right.
Okay. All right.
But they didn't add board members to any of those agencies, did they?
No, they just kept
They
it.
didn't add an elected board president or a college board president to any of that, did they?
Right, that's
Okay,
not
so
allowed.
it's a different comparison then.
Yeah. And
I'm
just
glad
on,
you're here. We can use you as a whipping board.
and just on the question of what would happen if the voters turn it down, the voters already voted it down, right? So we already, we'd be back where you are today.
We're back where we are today, and we'll look at the legal landscape and we'll decide what we need to do as far as going unilaterally to 5 districts, being forced to. We'll take that on. I mean, to my mind, if the voters say no, and the legal environment isn't forcing us to go to districts, I would not advocate just going to districts. I think the question will be if the voters say no, and developments in Santa Monica and elsewhere tell us that we're at risk, then we may just end up deciding to do it. But that's something we'll decide when the time comes.
I agree with you on that.
So I have a question on there were going to be other charter amendments we wanted to make or clean up our charter because it hasn't been cleaned up in like 30 years or longer for some of those. So where does that leave us with the other? Because I think some of the other ones I don't want to wait for.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Well,
yeah.
Well, if I may, so that's a good, thank you for asking that, because that's a good question. I mean, some of them are related to the district, expanding the size of the council, defining what the mayor's duties would be. So assuming we're putting that off to November, we wouldn't need to bring all those back. I think I would need some direction on council compensation. There was the other piece having to do with the civil service system, which will take us out longer anyway, so going to November might actually help us on that. And then some other small things. So I would need some direction. Do you want me to bring that piece of it back in November so the council can decide whether to add those items or not?
I would really like to see if we can have some info in front of us, if we can do the civil service in March, because that is also tied to a lot of the things that we have as priorities for our fiscal year 23-24, and it really matches up for us. And so I don't want to lose that opportunity. I mean, I've been raising it as far as we've been raising these districts. So if there is an opportunity for us to do it in March, I'd like to do it in March.
Okay, we'll analyze it. I'll have to sit down with the assistant city manager and kind of walk through some of the pieces with that and bring it back to you. Would you like the other piece to go with it too? Council compensation, or do we push do you want that to be part of the district discussion?
I feel, I don't know how I feel about council compensation without the.
No, I think that, if it wouldn't make sense to separate it out. My concern and the reason I would be inclined to have this pushed further out than the March election is because we are right now going up against a very tight deadline. And there's a lot, I think, that we should review about the charter. And I think that if we were to take the time to look at those other changes and propose them as a package to the public for reforming some of our governmental systems, it would make more sense versus doing, we would have to actually potentially spend more spacing it out than if we were to do it in one lump. So I'm not 100% sure. I'd like to have some answers on that, but you quoted us a figure that was one amount, and then for November, almost double that amount.
Oh, it's more than
Yeah.
20 times the amount.
Yeah,
So,
right.
so yeah, I mean, you have 1, 2, or 3 ballot measures that adds approximately $8,000 to the cost of the ballot. So let me do this. Let me take all the charter amendments, and I can write the council a report or a memo explaining kind of where things will be if you brought them in March for the March election versus if you brought them for November. Because as I'm thinking about right now, I can't I can't
Yeah.
recall every specific.
As for me, I mean, if we can get these procurement cleanups onto March, let's do it. If it's not going to be, difficult, let's just get that clean, because those are things we want to do. And then I agree, if we can do the civil service stuff in March, great. If we can't, then at least having this November option gives us, like, we don't have to wait for another 2 years on that.
Okay.
Okay?
And then, so-
Councilmember Devine, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this?
Would you like us to bring back these 7 maps for further discussion in November, or do you want us to do the outreach component with those 7 maps? I think that's the question of the day at this point.
Can I recommend?
Yeah.
If I can recommend, we've looked at the maps.
Yeah.
I think it would be worthwhile for you to take those maps and go to the stakeholders and have additional conversations with the wider audience. And I'm not talking about just public, open to the public community meetings. I'm talking about actual stakeholder meetings where they're invited as stakeholders, just like we do for everything else in the city, and get input from them both on the maps as well as other thoughts that they may have that should be included in the report back to us.
So I do think 7 is a lot for that, if we could try to get that number down, because some of the maps are probably similar in style. If we could get that down to like 3, I really think it'll be more productive. It's going to be very difficult for people to respond to 7 maps, and some of them I think are very similar. So I would say if we can on November 7th, or before November 7th, if we could, if we could try to get a slimmed down number so that when we do go out for these stakeholder meetings, and I agree this is a good idea, but it's just going to be more productive with a smaller subset.
No, I'd agree. If we can get it down to 3 or 4, that would definitely help hook the attention. As you say, in a stakeholder meeting, where that discussion goes, we may go into 20 maps by the time we're done pulling the older maps. But to get the discussion going, if we're down to 3 or 4, is a lot easier than if we're at 6 or 7 or 8.
Well, based on what you heard from us today, could you identify the 3 maps that really have different flavors to them, like capturing some of these concerns? Like, I know Councilmember Kasakian's talking about the Rancho coming down into a whole piece of South Glendale, maybe at least one that doesn't do that.
For that kind of thing, it actually really helps the outreach too if it's been council's decision. So it may be worth, maybe we put the 7 that you've come up with now on the agenda for just let's choose 3 focus maps, November 7th, and have, that gives you time to weigh in. It also puts it on the agenda so people may weigh in and let you know what they like.
As long as you can give us some guidance on, like, hey, these 2 maps are really very similar. So maybe we just pick one of those 2, or.
Well, not just that, but I had also mentioned if there are maps that feels like, someone from the South drew it and then like forgot about the 3 other districts, you can identify those. I think we've had these conversations in the staff briefings. So if there is an 8th map you want to bring back, or with notes saying like, this is what's wrong with this map, it feels like someone worked on this portion, but then, because that was what was important to them, and then like forgot about the rest. Those are the kind of things I'd like to see during that.
Yeah, I can take a look at that, and from the 7, say these 2 are the same, you might as well just pick one of them, or, this one includes South Focus, this one includes North Focus. I put them together into one map. I can take a look at that and bring it back to you on the
Right.
Okay.
November 7th.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Devine, sorry,
Yeah, that's okay. Mayor, I'm going to have to leave this meeting because I've got to come down for closed session, so if
Okay.
you'll excuse
all
at
right,
this
thank
point.
you.
I
thanks.
have one request.
Okay, Councilmember Najarian.
And that's that you please inform us of any extension of any contracts with either DMA or Tri-Pepe Smith or any other outside consultant. I know it might be within your signing authority, but I'd like to be aware of who they are and what they're getting and what their scope of work is on the contract.
Will do.
Okay, with that, is there a need for any roll call or no?
We don't need a motion, and we have pretty clear direction.
Okay,
Okay.
okay. So we will, I guess, adjourn this meeting.
I'll move
Do
to
I have a
adjourn.
motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Okay. So we are adjourned at 4:55. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go into closed session. We're ready? Okay, so we'll call the city council meeting to order at 4:56 PM. Roll call, please.
Council members Asadrian,
Here.
Divine, Kasakian,
Here.
Najarian,
Here.
Mayor Brotman.
Here. And your report, please?
The
Or the
closed-
item, the closed session items, please?
Closed session items are, closed session item A, conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, significant exposure to litigation pursuant to paragraphs D2 and E2 of Government Code Section 54956.9, one potential case. B, conference with labor negotiators. The city designated negotiators attending the closed session are Rubik Golanian, John Tachtalian, Michael J. Garcia, Jillian Van Meiden, Paula Adams, Amy Martin, Tim Ernst, Jason Bradford, and Laura Cately. The name of the employee organization is Glendale Firefighters Association. C, conference with legal counsel pending litigation, claim of Mikhailian, claim number 23-0051.
Mr. Mayor, we don't anticipate reporting on any of the items. I would note for the record that under item 1A, the facts and circumstances that may give rise to litigation are potential pay equity issues involving the position of city clerk.
Okay, and with that, we will recess to closed session.